Welcome to Wise Files. Please do not forget to subscribe, like the video, and share the video with your circle. We need your support to reach 1,000 members. Let us know where you are from and what time it is now in the comments. Tonight's gangster is Dutch Schultz, the beer baron of the Bronx. In the shadowed corners of American history, where ambition meets opportunity and morality bends under the weight of desire, few figures cast as long and complicated a shadow as Dutch Schultz. Born Arthur Flegenheimer to German, Jewish immigrants in the tenements of the Bronx, his journey from poverty to power tells a distinctly American story, one where the promise of prosperity collides with the darker impulses of human nature. The Prohibition era created a peculiar vacuum in American society, where laws meant to enforce temperance instead cultivated an underground empire of vice. Into this fractured landscape stepped Schultz, a young man whose early struggles against poverty and abandonment hardened into a ruthless determination to rise above his circumstances by any means necessary. What began as petty crimes in the immigrant slums of New York evolved into a criminal enterprise that would eventually control millions in illicit revenue, reshaping the underworld of America's greatest city. Schultz's reign as the beer baron of the Bronx, and later as the architect of Harlem's numbers racket, reveals how organized crime functioned not merely as a shadow economy, but as an alternate power structure, one that exploited gaps in governance and capitalized on human weakness. His story unfolds against the backdrop of a nation in transition, wrestling with questions of identity, morality, and justice that continue to resonate in contemporary America. Yet behind the calculated violence and business acumen that defined his public persona existed a man of contradictions, a ruthless criminal who read Shakespeare, a feared gangster who craved legitimacy, a figure whose brief life burned with terrible intensity before being extinguished in an equally violent fashion. His death at 34 in a Newark chop house marked not just the end of a man, but symbolized the closing of an era in American criminal history. The tale of Dutch Schultz serves as both historical document and cautionary parable. It illuminates how systems of inequality create environments where criminality can flourish, while reminding us that empires built on violence inevitably meet violent ends. As we follow his rise from the tenements to the heights of criminal power and his ultimate fall, we witness the unforgiving cycle of ambition untethered from conscience, a cycle that continues to play out in different forms across time. Now, pick your sweetest spot and enjoy tonight's story. This audiobook is based on true stories, but some events, characters, places, and conversations are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. The Lower East Side air hung thick with grime and possibility as the century turned. August 1901 brought a particularly oppressive heat to the tenements where the Flegenheimers welcomed their second child, a boy they named Arthur Simon, his small fists clenched against a world that promised nothing but demanded everything, his cries echoing through paper-thin walls that barely separated one family's struggle from another's. Emma Flegenheimer cradled her newborn son in arms, already weary from laundry and factory work, her German-accented whispers forming soft promises against his temple. Her husband Hermann stood nearby, his plumber's hands scrubbed nearly raw, but still bearing the dark crescents of grime beneath his nails. Their marriage was barely a year old, their hopes still intact, despite the crushing pressure of immigrant life in the Bronx. "He will have better," Herman said, the words part prayer, part determination. "Not like the old country, not like us." The tenement building on the eastern edge of the Bronx stood as a sentinel of immigrant dreams. 5 floors of weathered brick housing dozens of families stacked like volumes in a cramped library of human aspiration. The hallways smelled perpetually of boiled cabbage, coal smoke, and the peculiar mustiness of too many lives pressed together. From open windows came the babel of accents, Yiddish, Italian, Irish brogues, and the German-Jewish cadence of the Flegenheimers' native tongue. By 1904, when little Helen joined the family, the constellation of the Flegenheimers seemed fixed. Herman, Emma, Arthur, and the baby girl. Arthur toddled through narrow hallways, his mother's watchful eyes tracking his movements even as her hands remained busy with endless mending and washing. The family lived in the tightrope balance of working-class dignity, a constant calculation of pennies against needs, of pride against practicality. Herman moved the family several times in Arthur's early years, chasing better rents or proximity to work, but the geography of poverty remained constant. Whether in the Bronx or the crowded immigrant quarters of Manhattan, the dimensions of their world were measured in cramped rooms and shared toilets, in the weight of coal buckets carried up narrow stairs, in the sound of neighbors' arguments penetrating the walls. Young Arthur learned to navigate this landscape instinctively. By age 6, he could distinguish the hollow footsteps of the rent collector from the heavier tread of the iceman, could read his mother's face for signs of whether dinner would be substantial or merely sufficient. His eyes, dark and watchful, absorbed the street's education, which shopkeepers could be charmed for a penny sweet, which alleys offered shortcuts, which boys commanded respect. Then came 1910, and the family's fragile equation collapsed. Herman Flegenheimer, plumber, provider, father, disappeared like morning fog, leaving behind only empty spaces where promises had been. No explanation, no goodbye, just absence where presence should have been, silence where there should have been a father's voice. "Where is Papa?" Arthur asked repeatedly, his voice growing harder with each asking until the question itself became sharp enough to draw blood. Emma's answers thinned over time from reassurances to vagaries to, finally, silence. The 1910 census recorded her stark new reality in bureaucratic ink: divorced, sole provider, head of household. Winter that year seemed colder, the tenement darker. Emma took in more laundry, her raw hands cracked and bleeding in the harsh lye soap. Sometimes Arthur would watch her from the doorway as she worked, her lips moving in silent calculation of what could be stretched, what could be sacrificed, what could be delayed. In those moments, something hardened in the boy, a private architecture of resolve taking shape behind his eyes. School became increasingly irrelevant to Arthur. The drone of lessons about a country's glorious history meant little in rooms where the radiators clanged but rarely warmed, where teachers regarded immigrant children as raw material to be Americanized rather than understood. He was quick enough with numbers, sharp with patterns and what adults called street sense, but the larger purpose of education escaped him when measured against immediate needs. "Your son is bright," a teacher told Emma during a rare parent meeting, "but distracted, defiant when corrected." Emma nodded, hearing but unable to address a problem that seemed luxury compared to survival. "He is good boy," she insisted. "He helps at home." And he did. By 12, Arthur was contributing, running errands for neighbors, delivering parcels, sweeping storefronts. Small change accumulated in his pocket, like evidence of his growing utility. He brought most of it home to Emma, keeping just enough to occasionally treat himself to penny candies or admission to a Nickelodeon, where flickering images offered temporary transport from the Bronx's gravity. The streets taught what classrooms couldn't: the currency of respect, the mathematics of territory, the physics of threat and response. Boys formed loose affiliations that weren't quite gangs, but served the same function: protection, identity, belonging. Arthur found himself gravitating toward these clusters of youth with similar circumstances, fatherless, hungry for something beyond mere survival. "You got a quick mouth on you, kid," an older boy told him after Arthur had talked his way out of a beating for crossing the wrong block. "Better hope your feet are just as fast." By 14, the decision was made without formal announcement. School had given what it could: basic literacy, rudimentary arithmetic, but offered diminishing returns compared to immediate income. Arthur left after 8th grade, his mother's silent acquiescence speaking volumes about necessity. In 1916, Arthur, now 15, and already carrying himself with the squared shoulders of someone determined not to appear vulnerable, secured his first legitimate job at Clark Loose Leaf Company. The press room hummed with machinery that seemed to Arthur both miraculous and mundane: massive iron presses stamping patterns onto paper, the air thick with ink mist and the smell of hot metal. "Keep it moving, Flegenheimer," the floor manager barked. "Those forms don't feed themselves." Day after day, Arthur fed blank sheets into hungry machines that transformed them into ledger pages, order forms, business stationery. The monotony was broken only by the occasional paper jam or the rhythmic thumping when a press fell out of alignment. His hands became stained with ink that no amount of scrubbing could entirely remove, a blue-black shadow beneath his fingernails that marked him as working class. He brought home $9 weekly, more than Emma had ever managed through laundry, and presented it with quiet pride. For a brief moment, there was a symmetry to their lives, mother and son, providers both, making their way without Herman's ghost between them. "You're a good son, Arthur," Emma told him, her accent still thick despite a decade in America. She touched his cheek with a hand that had aged beyond its years. "A good son." The words warmed him, but couldn't fill the hollow where something else should have grown. Providing was necessary, but insufficient. It didn't answer the question that formed in his mind when he passed saloons, where men laughed easily, when he saw others his age deferring to their father's authority. How did a boy become respected without a model to follow? What made a man someone others wouldn't abandon? By 1917, Arthur had moved to a position at Caxton Press, where the work was similar but the pay marginally better. The world beyond the Bronx had erupted into the madness of the Great War, and America's entry that April sent ripples through every community. Young men in uniform appeared on street corners, in church halls, their presence both heroic and ominous. Recruitment posters plastered walls and fences, their colors garish against the city's monochrome palette. "You thinking about it?" asked Mo, another pressman at Caxton, nodding toward a poster showing a stern Uncle Sam pointing directly at the viewer. "They say it'll be over quick once our boys get over there." Arthur shrugged. "Got responsibilities here." The simple truth was that his status as his mother's primary support made him unlikely to be drafted, a fact that brought both relief and a strange disappointment. War seemed terrible, but it also represented the kind of dramatic transformation that normal life couldn't offer. The press room at Caxton became increasingly populated by older men as younger ones departed for training camps, creating unexpected opportunities for advancement. Arthur learned quickly, his hands developing a machinist's intuition for the temperamental equipment. The foreman noticed. "You got a feel for the machines, kid," he commented one evening as Arthur coaxed a bulky press back to operation. "Stick with it, there might be a future in it for you." A future. The concept seemed both tantalizing and suspect. Arthur nodded non-committally, already sensing that the pressman's trade, while honest, wouldn't answer the questions forming in his mind about power and its procurement. In the cramped apartment, Emma had hung a small American flag in the window, though whether from patriotic sentiment or protective coloration was unclear. Anti-German sentiment had risen with America's entry into the war, and many German Americans found it prudent to display conspicuous loyalty. "We are Americans now," she reminded Arthur and Helen, as if their identities could be established through declaration alone. "This is our country," but the streets told a different story about belonging. Territory was not granted, but claimed, then defended. Respect was not bestowed, but extracted. These lessons came not from the press room, but from the hours between work and home, in the fluid social geography of neighborhood corners and back alleyways. Arthur increasingly found himself drawn to the orbit of the Frog Hollow Gang, a loose collection of young men who controlled a small but significant patch of the Bronx. Their activities ranged from petty theft to protection rackets targeting local businesses, a crude but effective taxation system operating in parallel to legitimate commerce. "You got a good head on you, Arthur," said Tommy Ryan, one of the gang's more established members, "and you don't scare easy. That's worth something around here." The acknowledgement felt different from his mother's praise or his foreman's approval. It carried the weight of street validity, a currency Arthur was beginning to value above others. Small errands for the gang became more substantial involvement. standing lookout during burglaries, helping fence stolen goods, eventually participating in direct collections from shopkeepers who understood that payment purchased protection primarily from the collectors themselves. In 1918, Arthur shifted to a position at American Express as a manual laborer, loading and unloading freight. The work was physically demanding but offered contact with a wider cross-section of the city's commerce and opportunities to identify vulnerable shipments or delivery routes. His dual existence as legitimate worker and increasingly committed criminal required careful compartmentalization, a skill Arthur developed with natural aptitude. "You keep showing up on time, keep your mouth shut, and do the work. That's all we ask," his supervisor at American Express told him during a brief evaluation. "No complaints about you so far." The modest praise reflected Arthur's careful cultivation of an unremarkable work persona, reliable enough to avoid scrutiny, not ambitious enough to attract attention. Meanwhile, his street education accelerated under the tutelage of more established criminals, particularly at a neighborhood nightclub owned by Marcel Poffo. Poffo's establishment occupied the ground floor of a corner building, its windows painted black, its entrance unmarked except by a small brass plaque bearing only an address. Inside, the air was permanently hazed with cigarette smoke, the lighting deliberately dim, the back room accessible only to those Poffo personally cleared for entry. "You see, Arthur," Poffo explained one evening, his voice carrying the rough edges of a man who had learned his English in prison yards rather than classrooms, "most people think they want freedom, but what they really want is structure, someone to tell them what's what, how things are going to be. You provide that structure, they respect you for it." Poffo's criminal resume included numerous burglaries and stick-ups, but he had graduated to the more stable income of the nightclub, which served as both legitimate business and headquarters for various illegal enterprises. Under his guidance, Arthur graduated from petty theft to more organized criminal activity, robbing craps games in back rooms and basements, carefully selected apartment burglaries, and increasingly bold heists. "The thing about fear," Poffo continued, pouring Arthur a drink despite Prohibition's looming shadow, "is that it works both ways. People who are afraid of you will hate you for it, but they'll also do what you say. That's worth the hate." Arthur absorbed these lessons with the same intensity he had once applied to learning the mechanics of printing presses. The criminal ecosystem had its own logic, its own hierarchy, its own form of advancement. What began as economic necessity, supplementing his legitimate income to better support his family, evolved into something more fundamental, a path to the respect and control that had eluded him since his father's abandonment. By late 1918, as the war in Europe staggered toward its conclusion and a deadly influenza swept through New York's crowded tenements, Arthur Fleckenheimer stood at a crossroads. His legitimate employment record showed a young man of modest achievement and reasonable reliability. His criminal apprenticeship revealed something altogether different, a quick-witted, strategic thinker with an instinctive understanding of how fear could be leveraged into compliance. "You should come work for me full-time," Poffo suggested, as they counted the proceeds from a particularly successful burglary of a merchant's apartment on the Grand Concourse. "Why break your back at the Express when you're making twice as much with me in half the time?" Arthur considered the offer carefully, recognizing it as more than an employment proposition. It was an invitation to fully cross a threshold he'd been straddling. "I'll think about it," he replied, his characteristic caution evident even in moments of decision. What he didn't articulate, even to himself, was the growing recognition that neither world fully satisfied what had been forming in him since his father walked away, a hunger not just for survival or comfort, but for a particular kind of power, the ability to make others bend rather than bending himself, the capacity to inspire fear rather than feel it, the resources to ensure that he would never again be at the mercy of someone else's departure. Later that night, returning to the apartment where Emma waited up despite the late hour, Arthur found himself studying his reflection in the cracked mirror of the shared bathroom in the hallway. At 17, he already carried himself with the coiled watchfulness of someone much older. The face looking back at him was hardening into features that would soon be more man than boy. But what kind of man remained an open question. "You're late again," Emma observed when he entered, her voice carrying concern rather than accusation. "The factory works you too hard." "It's fine, Ma," he replied, placing some bills on the kitchen table. "Got a little overtime. Here's this week's money." The lie came easily, the partial truth of his dual income serving as both shield and currency. Emma's grateful smile suggested that she either believed him or chose to accept the fiction as preferable to whatever truth might lie beneath. In the narrow economy of their relationship, such tactical omissions were investments in her peace of mind. As the year drew to a close, with the war's end bringing celebrations to city streets even as influenza continued its grim harvest, Arthur made a decision that would ripple through the decades to follow. He accepted a position at Schultz Trucking as a driver and laborer, a legitimate job on paper, while deepening his involvement with Poffo's criminal enterprises. The duality suited him, visible respectability masking less visible power. It was an arrangement that reflected his emerging understanding of how the world actually functioned beneath its official narratives. Laws, he had concluded, were not moral principles, but simply rules established by those with the power to enforce them, and such power could be acquired through means other than inheritance or education. On a December evening, as snowflakes swirled through the cones of light cast by street lamps, Arthur walked through his neighborhood with the measured pace of someone taking inventory. Each shopkeeper who nodded nervously in recognition, each corner boy who stepped aside to let him pass, each glance of wary respect. These were the early returns on his investment in becoming someone who would never again be left behind. Arthur Flegenheimer was becoming something else, someone whose name would eventually fade beneath the weight of another identity altogether. But that transformation still lay ahead, beyond the boundaries of his youth. For now, he was simply a young man who had learned that in a world where family could dissolve and institutions failed, fear was the most reliable currency, and he intended to mint as much of it as necessary to secure the things that mattered: safety, respect, and the power to determine his own fate. The Bronx night enfolded him, its darkness both challenge and promise. Whatever morning brought, Arthur would meet it not as his father's abandoned son, but as his own creation architect of a future built on foundations of his own desperate design. The rain fell in thin, cold sheets over Blackwell's Island, turning the East River into a churning slate mirror beneath a colorless December sky. Inside the penitentiary, the institutional rhythm never changed. The jangling of keys, the shuffle of worn shoes on concrete, the metallic echo of cell doors that punctuated each passing hour like the ticking of some vast, merciless clock. Arthur Flegenheimer sat on the edge of his narrow cot, 17 years old, with eyes that had grown decades older during his incarceration. The sentence, 17 months for a burglary that had seemed so simple in conception, had stretched like a wasteland before him when first pronounced by the judge. Now, in December of 1920, he could feel freedom approaching. The date circled in his mind, December 8th. Flegenheimer, the guard's voice carried no particular malice, just the flat indifference of a man moving human inventory. "You got a visitor." Arthur didn't respond immediately. His reputation in the penitentiary had been built on calculated moments of silence, on never showing eagerness, particularly before the guards. He'd learned quickly that being Jewish in a prison population that scorned weakness meant creating a different persona. Someone harder, someone who would react with sudden, unpredictable violence when tested. "Did you hear me, Flegenheimer?" "I heard you," Arthur finally said, rising slowly. His frame was wiry but tensile, like steel cable wrapped in skin. The visitation room smelled of disinfectant and damp wool. His mother sat waiting, her hands clasped tightly on the scratched wooden table, worry etched into the lines around her eyes. Emma Flegenheimer had aged visibly since Arthur's sentencing. "You look thin," she said in lieu of a greeting. The food here isn't exactly Delmonico's, Arthur replied, the ghost of a smile touching his lips. But I manage. Emma glanced nervously at the guard by the door before leaning forward. They say you've been difficult, fighting, that's why they sent you to that farm in West Hampton. Arthur's eyes flickered. The work farm had been its own particular hell, monotonous labor under the watchful eyes of guards who seemed to take personal pleasure in breaking the spirit of young men from the city. The memory of his escape attempt surfaced, a desperate, poorly planned bid for freedom that had earned him recapture within hours and an additional 2 months tacked onto his sentence. They don't understand me here, Ma, he said quietly. These guards, they think they can break you down, make you into something tame. I'm not built for that. Emma sighed, a sound so heavy with resignation that it seemed to physically age her. The world is changing, Arthur. When you get out next week, the Prohibition laws are coming. Everyone's talking about it. Arthur nodded slowly. He'd heard the whispers, even inside. Prohibition was creating opportunities for men who weren't afraid to operate outside the law. The America that had sent boys like him to fight in Europe was now telling those same men they couldn't have a drink when they returned. The hypocrisy wasn't lost on him. I've kept your room, Emma continued. You can come home, start fresh. Maybe go back to school. I'm going back to work, Arthur interrupted. Schultz trucking said they'd take me back. His mother's expression tightened. Those men, Arthur, they're not a good influence. But Arthur wasn't listening. His mind had already drifted beyond these walls, beyond his mother's modest apartment in the Bronx. Something was forming in his thoughts. Not quite a plan, but a direction. The name Dutch Schultz had been following him since before his incarceration, a nickname borrowed from a notorious street fighter whose reputation still echoed in certain corners of the Bronx. Arthur had found himself answering to it more and more often. I'll be fine, Ma, he said, patting her hand with a gentleness that seemed incongruous with the hardness in his eyes. Trust me. 1 week later, Arthur Fleckenheimer walked through the main gates of the penitentiary, a free man for the first time in nearly a year and a half. The city that greeted him was familiar yet somehow altered, as if while he had been confined, New York had shifted slightly on its axis. The Bronx of December 1920 hummed with a nervous energy. Soldiers who had returned from the Great War jostled for scarce jobs, their military discipline giving way to an edgy restlessness. Prices for everyday goods had climbed so high that even formerly comfortable families felt the pinch. Arthur could see it in the tense shoulders of men waiting for work outside factories, in the careful way women counted coins at market stalls. His first stop wasn't his mother's apartment, but a smoky pool hall just off 3rd Avenue where he'd spent much of his youth before the arrest. The familiar green felt tables stood in the same positions, the click of balls and murmur of side bets creating the soundtrack he'd missed during his incarceration. Well, look what the cat dragged in, a voice called from the corner, if it ain't Dutch Schultz himself. Arthur turned to see Joey Marino, a small-time operator he'd known before his arrest. Marino was smirking around a cigarette, chalk dust coating the fingers of his right hand. Nobody calls me Arthur anymore, he asked, though there was something like satisfaction in his tone. Nah, Marino shook his head. That name don't fit you no more. Arthur sounds like some clerk counting pennies at a bank. You're Dutch now. Everybody knows it. Dutch. He rolled the name silently in his mind. Dutch Schultz. There was power in the reinvention, in shedding the identity that had been sentenced, confined, humiliated. Arthur Fleckenheimer was a Jewish boy from the Bronx who'd been caught during a clumsy burglary. Dutch Schultz could be someone else entirely. I hear you're looking for work, Marino continued, leaning closer. Not that delivery job at Schultz Trucking, real work. Dutch's eyes narrowed slightly. What kind of work? The kind that's about to be in high demand, Marino replied, voice dropping. January 17th, Prohibition becomes the law of the land. No booze, nowhere. Except, he smiled, everywhere. For those with the right connections. Dutch considered this. He'd seen enough of the city's underworld before his arrest to understand the implications. Prohibition wouldn't stop people from drinking. It would just change who profited from it. "I've got people you should meet," Marino continued. "Small crews operating in the neighborhoods. Nothing fancy yet, but they're positioning themselves. Protection, delivery, persuasion, skills like yours would be valuable." "I just got out," Dutch said carefully. "I'm not looking to go back in." Marino laughed, a short, harsh sound. "That's the beauty of it. This is going to be different. Half the cops will be on somebody's payroll. You think the whole damn city's suddenly going to go dry because some politicians in Washington say so." Later that night, Dutch sat in his mother's small kitchen, picking at a plate of brisket and potatoes she'd prepared for his homecoming. The apartment felt suffocating after only a few hours. The concern in her eyes, the gentle way she moved around him as if he might shatter, all of it reminded him of a life that no longer fit. "You've been quiet," Emma observed, sitting across from him. Dutch looked up from his plate. "Just tired, Ma, adjusting. Mr. Schultz called while you were out this afternoon. He says you can start again on Monday, driving deliveries." Dutch nodded, though his mind was elsewhere. The name, Schultz, resonated differently now. The old neighborhood fighter whose name he'd adopted had been feared once, respected in his way. There was something in that worth considering. "That's good," he said, the words hollow. Emma reached across the table, her work-worn hand covering his. "Arthur, promise me you'll be careful. The world out there, it's not kind to boys who make mistakes." Dutch looked at his mother's hand on his and felt a moment of genuine tenderness break through the hardened shell he'd grown while incarcerated. But it passed quickly, replaced by the cold clarity that had kept him alive in prison. "I'm not a boy anymore, Ma," he said quietly, "and I don't make the same mistake twice." The weeks following his release brought a routine that seemed designed to test Dutch's resistance to confinement of a different sort. By day, he drove delivery routes for Schultz Trucking, navigating the increasingly congested streets of the Bronx and Upper Manhattan. The work was honest but monotonous, and the pay barely covered the room he'd rented to escape his mother's watchful concern. By night, however, Dutch began moving in circles that represented a different kind of opportunity. Joey Marino had introduced him to a loose collection of neighborhood operators, mostly Jewish and Italian men who controlled small territories and specialized in acquiring goods that would soon be illegal. It was in a back room of a Bronx social club that Dutch first met Sam Gold, a heavy-set man in his 40s who controlled a network of gambling operations and spoke with the confidence of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "So you're the famous Dutch Schultz," Gold said, eyeing him across a table cluttered with playing cards and half-empty glasses. "I heard stories about you from Blackwell's. They say you're unmanageable." Dutch held the older man's gaze. "I don't like being managed." Gold laughed, the sound genuine enough to crinkle the corners of his eyes. "None of us do, kid. That's why we're in this life, and not punching time cards at some factory." He gestured to the empty chair opposite him. "Sit. Let's talk about what's coming." Dutch settled into the chair, noting the way the other men in the room deferred to Gold, creating space around him that seemed charged with respect and caution. "Prohibition is going to remake this city," Gold continued, pouring amber liquid from a decanter into 2 glasses. "The smart ones are getting positioned now." "For what, exactly?" Dutch asked, accepting the drink. "For the biggest transfer of wealth this country has ever seen," Gold replied. "The government just handed us a monopoly on something everybody wants. Booze. And they're going to waste their time and manpower trying to stop it. Which means prices go up, which means profits go up." He smiled. "And somebody's going to collect those profits." Dutch sipped his drink, feeling the burn of quality whiskey, better than anything he'd tasted before. "And where do I fit in?" Gold studied him for a moment. "I need men who understand how things work on the street, men who know how to deal with problems decisively. Joey tells me you've got a reputation for that." "I can handle myself," Dutch said simply. "It's more than that." Gold leaned forward. "This business we're building, it needs structure. hijacking shipments, protecting deliveries, making sure payments come in on time. It's not just muscle, it's organization. Dutch considered this. During his months in prison, he'd observed how the institution functioned, how power was maintained not just through force, but through systems, hierarchies, and strategic applications of fear. There was something appealing about applying those lessons to the streets. "I understand organization," he said finally. Gold nodded, satisfied. "It is good. I'm putting together a crew to handle some delicate matters. Enforcement mainly, but with an eye toward expansion. You'd start small, collecting debts, providing security at certain establishments. Prove yourself there, and we move forward." Dutch felt something shift inside him, a recognition that this moment represented a clear fork in his path. The legitimate job at Schultz Trucking offered security, but promised nothing beyond a lifetime of modest wages and respectable mediocrity. What gold offered was riskier but contained possibilities that resonated with something essential in Dutch's nature. "When do I start?" he asked. Gold smiled. "You already have." The early months of 1920 found Dutch Schultz moving with increasing confidence through a criminal ecosystem that was rapidly evolving in anticipation of Prohibition. His work for Sam Gold began with basic enforcement, standing menacingly in the background while Gold discussed insurance with nervous shopkeepers, delivering unmistakable messages to gamblers who had fallen behind on their debts. What separated Dutch from other young men performing similar functions was his capacity for calculated intimidation. He rarely resorted to outright violence when the suggestion of it would suffice, and when violence became necessary, he applied it with such sudden, focused intensity that the reputation of the incident spread far beyond the actual event. In a dingy apartment off Fordham Road, Dutch cornered a baker who owed Gold money for protection. The man, sweating through his undershirt, tried explaining that business had been slow. "Mr. Gold doesn't care about your business problems," Dutch said, his voice oddly calm as he methodically removed his suit jacket and folded it over a chair. "He cares about his money." "Please," the baker whispered, "I need more time." Dutch studied the man's face, noting the fear, the desperation. Then, without warning, he drove his fist into the wall beside the baker's head, plaster cracking around his knuckles. "Next week," Dutch said, voice unchanged despite the display, all of it, no excuses. He retrieved his jacket, brushed off some plaster dust and added, "I'm reasonable today, I won't be next time." He didn't need to throw a single punch. The next week, the baker paid in full. This measured approach caught Gold's attention. Most young guys, he told Dutch over drinks one evening, they want to prove something. They go too far, make a mess I have to clean up. You, though, you understand that fear works better when people know exactly what they're afraid of. Dutch nodded, accepting the compliment. "I learned that inside. The guards who screamed all the time, nobody respected them. But the ones who spoke quietly and you knew they meant every word, those were the ones you watched out for." Gold studied him thoughtfully. "You've got a head for this business, kid. Not just the muscle part, the thinking part." For Dutch, this recognition mattered more than the increasing cash that lined his pockets. In the complex hierarchy of New York's criminal networks, he was still a minor figure, but he was beginning to understand the architecture of power. How the Jewish gangs intersected with the Italian crews, how certain police precincts could be navigated with the right payments, how politicians maintained plausible deniability while accepting protection for certain businesses in their districts. He had traded his room for a better apartment, bought suits that fit his lean frame perfectly, and cultivated a deliberate presence. Quiet, watchful, precise in his movements. The name Dutch Schultz was spreading beyond his immediate circle, carrying with it a reputation for reliability and controlled danger. One rainy evening in early March, Dutch entered a speakeasy that had been operating quietly for years, but was now preparing for the windfall that Prohibition would bring. The owner, a ruddy-faced Irishman named Sullivan, had arranged for protection through Gold's organization. As Dutch settled at a corner table, Nursing a whiskey and monitoring the room out of habit, a man in an expensive suit approached. He was older, perhaps in his 50s, with the hard eyes of someone who had built something substantial through means that wouldn't withstand scrutiny. "You're Dutch Schultz," the man said, not a question. Dutch looked up slowly. "Who's asking?" "Frank Costello," the man replied, sliding into the seat opposite without invitation. "I've been hearing about you." Dutch maintained his composure, though internally he registered the significance. Costello was a rising figure in the Italian gangs, known for his intelligence and political connections. "All good things, I hope," Dutch said evenly. Costello smiled thinly. "Interesting things. They say you're making quite an impression with Gold's crew. Effective but not flashy. That's unusual in someone your age." Dutch said nothing, waiting. "The world is changing," Costello continued. "Prohibition is going to create opportunities that require cooperation between families, between organizations." "I'm just doing a job," Dutch replied carefully. Costello laughed softly. "We're all just doing a job, kid. The question is what job you want to be doing 5 years from now." He leaned forward. "Gold is old school, limited vision. The real future belongs to those who can think beyond neighborhood boundaries." With that, Costello placed a business card on the table. "When you're ready for a bigger conversation, call that number." He stood, straightening his tie. "No rush. But remember, in this business, opportunities don't wait forever." As Costello walked away, Dutch turned the card over in his fingers, considering its implications. At 17 months in the penitentiary had shown him what confinement meant. Now, barely 3 months after his release, the world was opening before him, dark and complicated, but filled with possibilities that matched the ambition growing inside him. He pocketed the card and finished his drink, watching the rain streak the windows of the speakeasy. Arthur Flegenheimer had entered Blackwell's Island as a boy caught in a petty crime. Dutch Schultz was emerging into a New York transformed by war, economic upheaval, and the approaching revolution of Prohibition, a city that would soon belong to men who understood that power came not just from violence, but from vision. Outside, the streets glistened beneath the street lamps, and somewhere in the distance, a police siren wailed briefly before fading into the textured silence of a city poised on the edge of transformation. The rain fell in rhythmic patterns across the Bronx that night, washing the streets in a silver sheen that reflected the sparse electric lights. It was 1925, and winter had draped itself over New York City like a wet wool coat, heavy, uncomfortable, but providing a strange kind of comfort against the greater cold. Dutch Schultz stood by the window of the small back office, watching droplets trace jagged paths down the glass. "Beautiful, ain't it?" Joey Noe remarked, not looking up from the ledger where he was totaling the week's earnings. All that rain making everybody thirsty. Dutch didn't answer immediately. His eyes followed a delivery truck as it rumbled down the street, its headlights cutting through the mist. 27 years old, and already he had built something from nothing. The name Dutch Schultz, the name he had chosen to replace Arthur Flegenheimer, was beginning to mean something in these neighborhoods. 500 grand this year, Joey finally said, closing the book with a soft thump. Not bad for a couple of boys from the neighborhood. Dutch turned from the window, a thin smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Beer Baron of the Bronx," he said, not without satisfaction, though the title still felt new on his tongue. "Prohibition's the best thing that ever happened to guys like us." "To guys smart enough to see opportunity," Joey corrected, leaning back in his chair. A tall Irishman with an easy charm that balanced Dutch's intensity, Noe had recognized something in Schultz when he'd hired him as a bouncer at the Hub Social Club. Not just the capacity for violence, though that was certainly there, but a meticulous mind, a way of seeing systems where others saw only chaos. "Smart and willing," Dutch added, crossing to the desk where a bottle of their own product sat alongside 2 glasses. He poured for both of them. The beer was good fresh from Frankie Dunn's brewery in Union City. Most people just complained when the Volstead Act passed. We built a business, Joey raised his glass, to lawmakers who don't understand human nature. They drank in companionable silence for a moment. Outside, the rain intensified, drumming against the roof in waves. The small office, tucked behind a legitimate-seeming front business, smelled of tobacco, damp wool, and the faint yeast scent that clung to men who trafficked in beer. A single lamp cast long shadows across the worn floorboards. Arnold wants to meet tomorrow, Dutch said finally. Says he's got some ideas about expansion. Rothstein? Joey's eyebrows raised slightly. The man's a gambler, not a bootlegger. Dutch shook his head. He's more than that. He sees how all the pieces fit. When Arnold talks, it's worth listening. Joey didn't argue. Arnold Rothstein had taken an interest in their operation over the past few months, offering strategic advice that had already paid dividends. The gambler and fixer had connections everywhere: police, politicians, other criminals, and a vision for how illegal enterprises could be structured like corporations. Dutch admired him perhaps more than any other man in New York. "You riding out with the Union City shipment tonight?" Joey asked, changing the subject. Dutch nodded. "The Rock brothers lost another truck last week. Someone's getting brave." "Or desperate," Joey said. "Times are changing. The easy money brings in amateurs." "Let them try," Dutch said, his voice dropping to that quiet place that made even hardened men uneasy. "I've got a shotgun that makes a very convincing argument." The truck swayed as it crossed into New York, its suspension groaning under the weight of beer barrels. Dutch sat in the passenger seat, a shotgun resting across his knees, his eyes constantly scanning the dark roadway. Beside him, the driver, a broad-shouldered man named Lenny whom Dutch trusted implicitly, hummed tunelessly as they navigated the wet streets. "You don't have to come on these runs yourself, boss," Lenny said, not for the first time. "We got guys for this." Dutch watched a police car pass without slowing, the officers inside deliberately looking the other way. The monthly payments ensured their blindness. "I don't ask my men to do anything I won't do myself," he replied simply. But it was more than that. Dutch found a strange peace in these midnight runs. The concrete practicality of moving product from point A to point B satisfied something in him. For a man whose early life had been chaotic, pushed from one small apartment to another, watching his father abandon the family, enduring his stepfather's cold indifference, the creation of order from disorder felt like redemption. "Besides," he added, "I sleep better knowing the job's done right." Lenny nodded, understanding in his eyes. They'd been hijacked once, about 8 months back. 3 men with pistols had stepped into the road, thinking they'd found easy prey. They hadn't expected the passenger to emerge firing a shotgun. Dutch hadn't killed them. He wasn't wasteful with lives, but they crawled away with memories they wouldn't soon forget. As they drove deeper into the Bronx, Dutch felt himself relaxing slightly. This was his territory now. Block by block, the Noah Schultz gang had established control through a careful balance of intimidation and service. They moved quality product. They paid on time. They protected their clients from harassment. And if someone refused to buy from them, well, accidents happened. "Pull over a McGinty's," Dutch instructed as they approached a small speakeasy tucked between a tailor and a shoe repair shop. "I want to check on something." Inside, the basement bar was hazy with cigarette smoke and murmured conversations. A piano player in the corner picked out a lazy ragtime tune, his fingers dancing across the keys while his eyes stayed half closed. The place wasn't packed, but it was respectably busy for a Tuesday. Dutch noted with satisfaction that every glass on every table contained beer from his operation. The owner, a ruddy-faced man with thinning hair, spotted Dutch immediately and hurried over. "Mr. Schultz," he said, his voice carefully deferential, "we weren't expecting a delivery tonight." "Just passing by, Thomas," Dutch assured him. "Everything running smooth?" "Like clockwork," the man nodded. "Quality's good, customers are happy." Dutch looked around the room, his eyes lingering on the faces of the drinkers. Working men mostly, with a scattering of better-dressed individuals seeking the thrill of illicit alcohol. Prohibition had changed drinking culture in America. What was once done openly was now wrapped in secrecy, which only seemed to make it more appealing. "I heard the Rock brothers came by last week," Dutch said casually, offering a better price. Thomas's face paled slightly. "They did, but I told them I was happy with our arrangement." Dutch smiled, placing a hand on the man's shoulder. "He is a smart man. Loyalty matters in this business." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a crisp $20 bill. "Buy your customers around. Tell them it's courtesy of Dutch Schultz." The gesture wasn't mere generosity. It was marketing, relationship building, and subtle intimidation all wrapped into one. As Dutch left the speakeasy, he could hear the appreciative murmurs following him out. This was how empires were built, not just through fear, but through a complex web of obligation, respect, and calculated kindness. Arnold Rothstein received them in his suite at the Park Central Hotel, a space that reflected its occupant, elegant without ostentation, comfortable without being soft. The man himself sat behind a desk of polished mahogany, his fingers steepled beneath his chin as he listened to Dutch outline their current operations. 500,000 annually, Rothstein nodded when Dutch finished. "Impressive. But you're thinking too small." Joey No shifted in his chair. "With respect, Mr. Rothstein, we've cornered the beer market in the Bronx." "Exactly," Rothstein said, his voice smooth as aged whiskey. "You've conquered one borough. New York has 5. Dutch leaned forward. "The Italians have Manhattan locked up tight. Brooklyn's a war zone. I'm not suggesting territorial expansion, not yet." Rothstein rose from his desk and crossed to a cabinet, from which he removed a decanter of amber liquid. He poured 3 glasses without asking if they wanted any. "What I'm suggesting is vertical integration." "Meaning?" Dutch accepted the glass, appreciating the smooth burn of what was clearly premium Canadian whiskey. "You're buying from Frankie Dunn's brewery," Rothstein explained. "Why not own a piece of it? Control your supply chain. And why stop at beer? There's more profit in whiskey, in gin. The upper classes don't want beer at their fancy parties." Dutch considered this. He'd always focused on beer because it was what he knew, what the working men of the Bronx demanded. But Rothstein's vision was broader, seeing opportunities that Dutch had overlooked. "You could also diversify," Rothstein continued. "The alcohol business is profitable now, but laws can change. Smart money builds multiple revenue streams." "Like what?" Joey asked. "Gambling, loans, union control." Rothstein's eyes settled on Dutch. "You have the temperament for expansion, Mr. Schultz. You understand that violence is a tool, not an end in itself. You could build something that outlasts Prohibition." Dutch sipped his whiskey, letting the possibilities unfold in his mind. He'd started as a simple hijacker, graduated to working for others, and now commanded his own operation. Each step had seemed like the pinnacle at the time, yet each had merely been a rung on a ladder that stretched higher than he could see. "I appreciate the advice," Dutch said finally, "and the introductions you've made." Rothstein smiled thinly. "Luciano, Lansky, Siegel, they're the future. Young men with vision, like yourself. Old boundaries. Italian, Jewish, Irish. They're becoming irrelevant. It's all about business now." After they left the hotel, Joey was uncharacteristically quiet as they walked through the evening crowds of Midtown Manhattan. The theater district was coming alive, marquees blazing with electric light, well-dressed couples flowing toward restaurants and shows. "You trust him?" Joey finally asked as they waited for their car. Dutch watched a woman in a beaded dress laugh at something her companion said, her head tilting back to reveal the elegant line of her throat. "I trust his intelligence," he answered carefully, "and I trust his self-interest. As long as we're useful to each other, we'll get along fine." Joey nodded, understanding the distinction. "He's right about one thing, we could be bigger than we are." "We will be," Dutch said with quiet certainty. "This is just the beginning." The brewery in Union City, New Jersey smelled of hops and yeast, a rich, earthy aroma that reminded Dutch of fresh bread. He walked between massive copper tanks, trailing his fingers along their cool surfaces as Frankie Dunn explained the brewing process. Fermentation takes about a week, the ruddy-faced brewery owner was saying, his voice echoing in the cavernous space. Then we age it another few weeks before barreling. Dutch nodded, though his mind was elsewhere. Following Rothstein's advice, he had come to discuss acquiring a stake in the operation, but something else had caught his attention. Near the loading docks, he had noticed a group of men he didn't recognize receiving a shipment of barrels. "Who are they?" Dutch asked, nodding toward the men. Frankie's expression tightened slightly. "New customers, from Queens." "I didn't know you supplied Queens." "Business is business," Frankie shrugged, a touch defensively. "They pay well, pay on time." Dutch said nothing but filed the information away. Expansion worked both ways. If he was looking to grow beyond the Bronx, others might be looking to encroach on his territory. They continued the tour, discussing numbers and percentages, the cost of ingredients versus the profit on each barrel. Dutch had a head for figures, another quality that set him apart from many of his contemporaries. Violence might command fear, but understanding money commanded respect. 20%, Dutch said finally, naming his price for investment, and preferential pricing on all deliveries to the Bronx. Frankie balked. "That's steep for a silent partner." "Who said anything about silent?" Dutch smiled, but his eyes remained serious. "I protect what I own, Frankie. My trucks get through. My customers stay happy. That's worth something." The negotiation continued over lunch in a small restaurant near the brewery. Dutch ate methodically, giving each bite his full attention while Frankie grew increasingly animated, his hands gesturing as he argued his position. By the time coffee arrived, they had settled on 15% ownership, with an option to increase to 25% after 1 year, contingent on certain production targets being met. "You drive a hard bargain," Frankie said, extending his hand across the table. Dutch shook it firmly. "Fair, though, we both win." As they left the restaurant, Dutch noticed a black sedan parked across the street, 2 men sitting inside watching them. He didn't recognize them, but something in their posture, the alertness, the studied casualness, marked them as something other than ordinary citizens. "Friends of yours?" he asked Frankie, nodding toward the car. The brewery owner followed his gaze and frowned. "Never seen them before." "Might be feds," Dutch said thoughtfully. "They'd be more active lately. Nothing to worry about if your paperwork says you're making near beer." Frankie's nervousness was obvious. Of course, everything's in order." Dutch clapped him on the shoulder. "Relax. Even if they are watching, what can they do? Everyone drinks. Even the judges and prosecutors who are supposed to enforce the law. Prohibition's a joke. And we're just the punchline they don't want to admit they laugh at." The conflict with the Rock Brothers began slowly, almost imperceptibly. First came rumors that they were offering lower prices to some of Dutch's steadiest customers. Then a truck was delayed, its driver returning with a black eye and a vague story about road trouble. Small provocations, testing the waters. Dutch watched, waited, and prepared. In the back room of what had once been the Hub Social Club, and was now the unofficial headquarters of his operation, he gathered his lieutenants around a map of the Bronx marked with delivery routes and customer locations. "They're probing," he explained, indicating the areas where the Rock Brothers had made inroads, looking for weak points. "So we hit back," one of the men suggested. "Send a message." Dutch shook his head. "Not yet. First we shore up our defenses, double the men on each truck, visit every customer personally, remind them of the benefits of doing business with us." Joey Noe, standing by the window smoking a cigarette, turned to face the room. "And if they still choose to buy from the Rocks?" A momentary silence fell. Everyone present knew what Joey was really asking. How far were they willing to go to maintain their monopoly? "Then we make an example," Dutch said quietly, "one that nobody will misunderstand." The room nodded in collective agreement. There was a certain comfort in clarity, in knowing exactly where the boundaries lay and what happened when they were crossed. The following week was a blur of activity. Dutch personally visited 37 establishments, from speakeasies to restaurants to social clubs. He shook hands, bought rounds, listened to complaints, and made promises. Where necessary, he also made threats, though always wrapped in the language of business. Protection wasn't just about safety from external threats, it was also about protection from what might happen if you made the wrong choice. At night, he rode with the delivery trucks, shotgun across his knees, his eyes constantly scanning the darkness for signs of ambush. The routine was exhausting but exhilarating. This was empire building at its most fundamental level. On a cold Friday evening in late 1926, Dutch sat in a booth at the back of a small Italian restaurant in the northern Bronx. The owner, a nervously smiling man named Carlo, had recently been approached by the Rock brothers with an offer to switch suppliers. Dutch had arrived unannounced, ordered the house specialty, a plate of linguine with clam sauce, and eaten it methodically while making small talk. Only when his plate was clean did he address the real reason for his visit. "I hear John Rock came by last week," he said, dabbing at his mouth with a napkin. "Offered you a good deal on beer." Carlo's smile faltered. "Mr. Schultz, I told him I was happy with our arrangement." "But you considered it," Dutch noted, his voice mild. "That's natural. Business is business." "Exactly," Carlo nodded eagerly. "Just business, nothing personal." Dutch leaned back in the booth, studying the man's face. "That's where you're wrong, Carlo. In this business, everything is personal. The beer I send you, I personally make sure it's the best quality. The deliveries that arrive on time, even in bad weather, I personally guarantee them. The protection you enjoy from harassment, that's my personal promise to you." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small leather notebook, flipping it open to a blank page. "So when someone like John Rock comes in and tries to undo all that personal attention I've given you, well, it feels like a personal insult to me." Carlo's face had gone pale. "Mr. Schultz, please, I didn't." Dutch held up a hand, silencing him. "I'm not angry, Carlo, I'm disappointed. But I understand temptation. We're all susceptible to it." He pulled a pen from his pocket and wrote something in the notebook before tearing out the page and sliding it across the table. Carlo looked down at it in confusion. It was a number, 250. "What's this?" Carlo asked. "That's the amount you're going to donate to the local orphanage," Dutch explained. "In your name, of course. As a gesture of community goodwill." Relief flooded Carlo's features. "Of course, Mr. Schultz, right away." "And Carlo." Dutch rose from the table, placing a generous tip beside his empty plate. "The next time John Rock or his brother comes calling, you tell them you're spoken for. Permanently." As he left the restaurant, Dutch felt a familiar satisfaction. The Rock brothers were making a fundamental mistake. They saw the beer business as simply a matter of product and price. Dutch understood it was about relationships, complex webs of obligation, fear, and mutual benefit. It was about knowing when to threaten and when to reward, when to push and when to retreat. It was, in its own way, an art form. The confrontation, when it finally came, was almost anticlimactic. Dutch received word that the Rock brothers were personally overseeing a delivery to 3 establishments that had recently been customers of his. It was a deliberate provocation, a public statement of intent. Dutch and Joey No intercepted them outside the second delivery, a small jazz club on Tremont Avenue. The evening had turned cold, and Dutch's breath formed small clouds in the air as he approached the truck where John Rock stood, supervising the unloading of barrels. "Evening, John," Dutch called out, his hands thrust deep in the pockets of his overcoat. "Bit far from your usual territory, aren't you?" Rock turned, his face registering first surprise, then a forced casualness. "Dutch, just following the business where it leads." "Interesting philosophy," Dutch nodded, stopping a few feet away. Behind him, Joey and 3 other men spread out slightly, their postures relaxed but alert. "I've always preferred to lead the business where I want it to go." John's brother Joe emerged from the club doorway, tensing visibly when he saw the gathering on the sidewalk. "Everything all right out here?" Just a friendly conversation between colleagues, Dutch assured him, though his tone suggested it was anything but friendly. I was explaining to John here that there seems to be some confusion about distribution rights in this neighborhood. No confusion, Joe said, moving to stand beside his brother. Free market. Customers choose who they want to buy from. Dutch smiled thinly. That's a very progressive attitude. But you see, I've invested a lot in this neighborhood. Money, time, personal attention. Created a certain expectation of quality and reliability. So when someone comes along and disrupts that harmony, well, it creates problems that nobody really wants. The threat hung in the air, unspoken but unmistakable. Around them, the normal evening activities of the neighborhood continued. People walking home from work, shopkeepers closing up, the distant sound of a phonograph playing through an open window. Yet between the two groups of men on the sidewalk, a different reality existed, one governed by older, more primitive rules of territory and power. You suggesting we back off? John asked, his voice tight. I'm offering you an opportunity, Dutch corrected him. The Bronx is established, but Queens is still wide open. I have no interest there. You could build something substantial without this unnecessary friction. The brothers exchanged glances, some unspoken communication passing between them. Finally, Joe spoke. We'll consider it. Dutch nodded once, satisfied for now. Good. Consider it carefully, because this is the only conversation we're going to have on the subject. He turned and walked away, Joey and the others falling in beside him. No shots had been fired, no blood spilled, yet Dutch knew something significant had just occurred. A boundary had been drawn, a warning delivered. What happened next would depend entirely on whether the Rock brothers were smart enough to recognize the danger they faced. As they rounded the corner, Joey lit a cigarette, the flare of his match briefly illuminating his face in the gathering darkness. You think they'll back down? Dutch considered the question. If they're intelligent, yes. If not, he left the thought unfinished. If not, Joey completed the sentence, then we show them why they should have been smarter. Dutch nodded, his mind already turning to contingency plans. The brewing conflict with the Rock brothers was, in many ways, inevitable, a natural consequence of success in their line of work. Power attracted challengers. Territory inspired envy. A reputation for strength had to be continuously reinforced. Looking up at the night sky where stars were faintly visible beyond the city's glow, Dutch felt a strange sense of clarity. This life he had chosen, or perhaps that had chosen him, followed its own inexorable logic. There was a purity to it, a straightforward honesty that regular society, with its hypocrisy and shifting rules, often lacked. In the world Dutch Schultz had built, cause and effect were clear. Actions had consequences, loyalty was rewarded, betrayal was punished. Simple principles for a complex time. As they walked through the Bronx streets, his streets, Dutch found himself looking forward to whatever came next. The Volstead Act had created not just an economic opportunity, but a chance to build something that reflected his own vision of order. Whether the Rock brothers bent to his will or forced his hand, the result would be the same. The continued expansion of that vision, one block, one barrel, one decision at a time. The rain had started again, gentle at first, but quickly intensifying. Dutch turned up his collar against the chill and smiled slightly to himself. In a city washed by rain and darkness, he had found his purpose. Beer baron of the Bronx today. Tomorrow, who could say? The possibilities, like the city itself, seemed limitless. The coppered glow of street lamps seeped through the Bronx night, pooling in oily puddles left by an afternoon drizzle. Winter's grip had loosened, but spring still held its promises close, teasing the borough with occasional warm afternoons before plunging temperatures back down at sunfall. The streets had that particular early 1928 rhythm Prohibition confidence, mingled with economic optimism. Jazz notes drifting from hidden clubs, automobile engines growing more numerous with each passing month. Dutch Schultz stood at the window of his second-floor office above a brewery, watching his territory through glass smudged by city grit. He wore his success like his tailored suit, precise, intentional, with no loose threads. At 36, Arthur Flegenheimer had buried his birth name so completely that even in his own thoughts he was Dutch Schultz now. The transformation was complete. Behind him, Joey Noe lounged in a leather chair, feet propped on the desk's corner, hat tipped back on his head. Their partnership had transformed the Bronx beer trade into something disciplined, efficient, profitable, everything Dutch demanded from his world. "They still saying no?" Dutch asked, not turning from the window. "The Rock Boys think they got roots here," Joey said, lighting a cigarette. "John and Joe been running that north section since before the Volstead. Figure that gives them rights." Dutch nodded almost imperceptibly. "Rights," he repeated, the word floating in the air between them like smoke. The Noe Schultz operation had expanded through the Bronx with the inevitability of the tide. Block by block, route by route, they had made themselves the borough's primary supplier of beer. The breweries, the trucks, the protection, the distribution, they owned the vertical integration that made fortunes. But the Rock Brothers' territory remained a stubborn island of resistance in their sea of control. "John Rock came up in person yesterday," Joey continued, exhaling a thin stream of smoke toward the ceiling. "Said they'd been fair, kept to their corners, never moved on ours. Says there's enough for everybody." Dutch turned slowly from the window. In the dim light, his features seemed carved from something harder than flesh. "Enough," he said quietly. "You know what enough means, Joey. Enough means someone else decides what you deserve. Enough means you accept limits." He moved to his desk, settled into his chair. The room was sparse function over comfort, utility over display. No photographs or paintings hung on the walls. Nothing personal lived here, except ambition. "I don't do enough," he said finally. The next morning broke grey and cool over the East River. Dutch sat in the back of a black Packard as it rolled through streets still quiet from the night. Beside him, Bo Weinberg adjusted his coat, revealing the holstered weight beneath. Dutch had hired Bo and his brother George recently, along with the Cole brothers, Vincent and Peter, as the operation expanded. "You didn't claim territory without showing you could hold it." The older brother, Joe Rock, "He's the voice," Dutch said, watching the passing storefronts. "The stubborn one. John just follows." Bo nodded, understanding the implications without needing them spelled out. "You want subtle, we want a message?" Bo asked. Dutch considered this as the car turned onto a street lined with warehouses and delivery bays. "I want them educated," he answered finally. Later that night, in a brick warehouse near the Harlem River, Joe Rock discovered the difference between resistance and education. They took him from his car as he left a restaurant. 4 men materializing from shadow, efficient and wordless. No gunshots, no commotion, just the sudden absence of a man who, hours earlier, had believed in his own security. Dutch sat at a desk in the warehouse office, ledgers open before him when they brought Rock in. The space smelled of leather, oil, and the metallic tang of the meat hooks hanging from the ceiling track system, a former packing plant repurposed for storage. Dutch didn't look up immediately, letting the man stand there, feeling the weight of silence. Finally, Dutch closed his ledger. "Mr. Rock," he said, as if greeting him at a business lunch. "Thank you for coming." Joe Rock, a heavy-set man with thinning hair and a face that had once been handsome before years of drinking, had bloated it, struggled against the men holding his arms. "You're making a mistake, Schultz," he spat. "We got friends, we got connections." Dutch nodded thoughtfully. "Connections," he repeated, a habit of his, this echoing of significant words. "Let's discuss your connections." What followed was not a conversation, but a demonstration. Dutch never raised his voice. He spoke about territory and opportunity, about cooperation and consequence, while his men translated his words into physical argument. When they finally suspended Rock by his thumbs from one of the meat hooks, Dutch approached him, studying the man's face as dispassionately as a doctor might examine a patient. "The problem with saying no," Dutch explained softly, "is that it closes doors. I'm a businessman, I open doors." He nodded to one of his men, who produced a small package wrapped in gauze. "This is special," Dutch continued, "from a doctor who appreciates our products, a little scientific miracle." The gauze, soaked in a discharge from a gonorrhea infection obtained from a corrupt medical orderly, was wrapped around Joe Rock's eyes. Dutch watched without expression, then turned away as the man's screams echoed through the cavernous warehouse. "When he understands," Dutch told Bo Weinberg, "take him back to his brother, make sure they can both clearly see the future." The morning after, Dutch sat in a back booth at a small diner on Fordham Road. The coffee was bitter but hot. Joey Noe slid in across from him, ordered his own cup, then leaned forward. "It's done," he said quietly, words already moving through every speakeasy and beer joint in the Bronx. "The Rock brothers are out. Joe's," he hesitated, "he won't be seeing any more opportunities. Permanently." Dutch stirred his coffee, watching the dark liquid swirl, "and the brother, John packed up this morning, left a message he won't be a problem." Dutch nodded, satisfied. The demonstration had accomplished exactly what he intended, not just removing the Rock brothers from the equation, but transforming their removal into mythology. Fear traveled faster than bullets, covered more territory. "We own the Bronx now," Joey said, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "The Bronx is just geography," Dutch replied. "We're not in the geography business." The waitress refilled their cups. Outside, delivery trucks rumbled past, the city's commercial pulse beating steadily. "Legs diamonds pushing at our borders," Joey said after she walked away. "His people been talking to some of our Manhattan customers, offering better rates." Dutch's face remained impassive, but something hardened in his eyes. Jacklegs. Diamond had been a thorn for months now, expanding his operation, testing boundaries. It wasn't business anymore. It was personal. "Let him push," Dutch said. "When something pushes, you learn where its balance is." That afternoon, Dutch visited one of their breweries, a 3-story operation humming with machinery and men. The air was thick with the yeasty smell of fermenting mash. Trucks lined the loading dock, workers rolling barrels with practiced efficiency. This was what mattered, not the violence, not the threats, but the industry they'd built. The business. Vincent Mad Dog Cole met him on the brewery floor, a lean young Irishman with cold eyes and quick hands. There was something unpredictable about Cole that made even Dutch's hardened men wary around him. But that same quality made him valuable. "Diamond sent some boys around to Murphy's place on 38th, Cole reported. "Broke some bottles, scared the customers, left a message about new management coming soon." Dutch nodded, watching the bottling line. Glass clinked against glass in rhythmic procession. "Murphy's paid up?" he asked. "Every week, on time," Cole confirmed. Dutch walked slowly along the line, occasionally reaching out to touch a bottle as it passed, feeling the cold glass against his fingertips. Each one represented profit, system, control. "Then Murphy's protected," he said simply. That evening, 3 of Diamond's men were found in an alley behind Murphy's establishment, each with both kneecaps shattered. No witnesses came forward. No arrests were made. The message traveled back to Diamond in its own wordless way. The war had begun. Dutch understood the language of escalation. In his office that night, he gathered his inner circle, Joey Noe, Bo and George Weinberg, and the Cole brothers. Maps of the Bronx and Upper Manhattan were spread across the desk, territories marked in pencil. "Diamond thinks this is about borders," Dutch told them, "about who owns what streets, but we're not in a real estate discussion." Bo Weinberg leaned against the wall, arms crossed over his broad chest. "What are we in then?" Dutch's smile didn't reach his eyes. "We're in an education business, same as with the Rocks. Diamond needs to learn that some lessons cost more than others." Over the next weeks, the turf war with Diamond escalated in precise increments. Where Diamond's men threatened, Schultz's men demonstrated. Where Diamond pushed, Schultz removed. The violence was targeted, methodical, never random, never wasteful. Dutch operated like a chess player, thinking 3 moves ahead while Diamond reacted. But the Bronx Spear operation, however profitable, wasn't enough anymore. Dutch had begun looking toward Harlem, toward a system of betting known as the numbers game, a daily lottery that pulled money from thousands of small-time bettors across the neighborhood. Policy slips, they called them. Dreams sold in carbon paper and mathematical odds. In Harlem, however, the numbers game wasn't just gambling. It was an institution, an economic structure built by and for the black community. And at its center stood Casper Holstein, the Bolita King, whose operation employed hundreds and whose profits flowed partly back into community programs. Dutch and Joey No sat in a parked car on Lenox Avenue, watching the normal rhythms of Harlem street life on a warm spring evening. Couples strolled past, music drifted from open windows, children played under the watchful eyes of neighbors. Holstein's got this place locked down, Joey observed. Numbers runners on every block, collection points in every other store. They say he makes 10,000 a day. Dutch watched a numbers runner enter a barber shop across the street, a young man in a neat suit carrying nothing but a small notepad and the day's collected bets. 10,000 a day, Dutch repeated softly, and he's not even Italian or Irish. Black man built himself a kingdom, Joey said. Got to respect the hustle, even if. I don't respect territories, Dutch interrupted. I respect systems, and systems can be acquired. The next morning, Dutch met with Otto Berman, a bookkeeper he'd begun consulting for his more complex financial arrangements. Berman was different from the muscle, a mathematician, a thinker, a man who saw patterns in numbers that others missed. The numbers game in Harlem, Dutch began, sliding a sheet of rough calculations across the desk. Explain it to me. Berman adjusted his glasses, studied the figures. Simple concept, complex execution, he said. Thousands of small bets, pennies and nickels, on 3-digit numbers. The winning number comes from racing results, usually. The odds against winning are 1,000 to 1, but they pay around 600 to 1. The margin, 40%, Berman replied. Minimum, sometimes more, depending on how they shade the payouts. It's pure mathematics in their favor. Dutch nodded. And Holstein runs this whole operation. He built it, Berman confirmed. Started small after the war, grew it into what amounts to an underground bank for Harlem. Some call him the mayor of Harlem. He's not just a gambler, he's a patron. Funds, community programs, bail funds, scholarships. A philanthropist, Dutch said, the word coated with irony. Of sorts, Berman agreed. But don't mistake it. His operation is tight protected. He's got political connections, police arrangements. It's not just a racket, it's an institution. Dutch leaned back, considering this. Institutions change hands. In the weeks that followed, Dutch began moving chess pieces into position around Holstein's kingdom. First came the intelligence, learning the numbers operation from the inside, mapping its collection points, its banking system, its protection arrangements. Then came the pressure, small at first, just enough to test the defenses. A collection point robbed here, a runner intimidated there. Holstein responded as expected, shoring up security, sending messages back through intermediaries. He was no stranger to territorial disputes, but Dutch wasn't interested in negotiation. On a September evening, 5 white men in dark coats approached Holstein as he left a social club on 135th Street. The street was busy but not crowded, with just enough witnesses to spread the story but not enough intervention to prevent what followed. Holstein was guided firmly into a waiting car, his dignity intact but his freedom suddenly dramatically compromised. Dutch wasn't present for the abduction. He remained in his office when they brought word that Holstein was secured in a brownstone in the Bronx. The ransom demand, $50,000, had already been communicated to Holstein's associates. Not too much that they can't raise it, Bo Weinberg reported, but enough to hurt. Dutch nodded. And the other arrangements? In place, Bo confirmed. The police captain got his envelope. When the time comes, they'll find what we need them to find. 2 days later, Holstein was released after his people delivered the ransom. He returned physically unharmed, but fundamentally changed. The kidnapping itself was only the first act. The seconds came a week later when police raided several of Holstein's operations simultaneously, finding exactly the evidence they needed for gambling violations. The message was clear: resistance would bring not just criminal violence, but the weight of corrupted law. By early October, Dutch Schultz's expansion into Haarlem's numbers game had begun in earnest. Not a complete takeover. That would come later. But the first intrusions into what had been Holstein's exclusive domain. The Bolito King's influence waned as Dutch's grew, street by street, block by block. In his office overlooking the Bronx night, Dutch reviewed ledgers with Otto Berman. The numbers told a story of expansion, of new revenue streams, of a business empire growing beyond beer and protection into more sophisticated territories. The Haarlem operation can generate 3 times what we make in beer, Berman explained, pointing to his projections. Less risk from federal agents too. Prohibition they care about. Numbers games. He shrugged. That's just local vice. Dutch nodded, satisfied. And Diamond? Contained, Berman replied. His suppliers are having difficulties. His protection costs have doubled. Market forces, you might say. Dutch allowed himself a small smile at that. The market always corrects. Later that night, after the others had gone, Dutch stood again at his window, looking out over the city that increasingly bent to his systems. The Bronx was secure now. The Rock brothers eliminated as factors, their territory absorbed, their customers now loyal through the most reliable motivation, fear. The war with Legs Diamond continued, but the trajectory was clear. And now Haarlem's numbers game was opening to him, Holstein's kingdom proving more vulnerable than its reputation suggested. Dutch felt a rare moment of satisfaction as he watched the city lights. From the East River to the Haarlem River, from working-class neighborhoods to jazz clubs, from breweries to betting parlors, it was becoming his city. A system he controlled, a machine that generated not just money but power. The kind of power that rewrote rules. A light rain began to fall, streaking the window glass, blurring the lights into watery halos. Dutch didn't mind. Even through distortion he could see clearly now, the path forward, the next moves. The quiet in the office was broken only by the soft patter of rain and the distant sound of traffic. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new resistances to overcome, but tonight, in this moment, Dutch Schultz-born Arthur Fleckenheimer in the Bronx poverty stood at the window of his empire and allowed himself to believe in his own mythology. Outside, the city continued its restless sleep, unaware that its dreams were increasingly shaped by the quiet man at the window. The rain fell, the lights blurred, and somewhere in the darkness the next lesson waited to be taught. The distant rumble of thunder matched the muted conversations in the back room of the Haarlem speakeasy as Dutch Schultz stared at the amber whiskey in his glass. Outside, the skies had opened up, sending sheets of rain cascading down on Manhattan streets where men with hollow eyes sold apples on corners, and women hurried past with collars turned up against the chill of late 1928. Arthur Fleckenheimer, known to all who mattered as Dutch Schultz, swirled the liquor, watching it catch the dim light. The room smelled of cigar smoke, cologne, and the particular tension that accompanies men who carry weapons beneath their tailored suits. 3 of his lieutenants sat around the table, their faces partially obscured by shadow, waiting for him to break the silence. "Joey won't make it through the night," Bo Weinberg finally said, his voice low and measured. "Doc says he's done everything he could." Schultz's face remained impassive, though something flickered behind his eyes, a cold fire being carefully banked. Joey No, his friend and business partner, had been clinging to life for over a month now, riddled with bullets from Jack Diamond's ambush outside the Chateau Madrid. "Lewis," Schultz asked quietly. Abe Landau, seated to Schultz's right, shook his head once. "Buried him yesterday. Small ceremony. His mother was there." The loss of Louis Weinberg in the same ambush had been another blow. Dutch set his glass down without drinking, his movements deliberate, controlled. Diamond wouldn't have made this play without backing, Schultz said, his voice eerily calm. Someone's financing him, giving him protection. Word is, it's Rothstein, Bo offered. The name hung in the air. Arnold Rothstein, the man they called the Big Bankroll, chess player of the underworld, the gambler who fixed the World Series, the shadow behind a dozen operations across the city. He's denied it, Landau said. Of course he denied it, Schultz replied. Man like that doesn't sign his work. Outside, lightning illuminated the rain-slicked streets for a brief moment before plunging them back into darkness. A waitress approached their table, sensed the atmosphere, and retreated without a word. Joey recognized you during the worst of it, Landau said. Asked for you. Said something about remembering Coney Island. Something shifted in Schultz's expression then, a momentary softness that vanished as quickly as it had appeared. He and Joey had started small, working their way up through the Bronx beer trade. Joey had been more than a partner. He'd been the one person who understood Schultz's vision, who helped translate ambition into empire. They're saying Diamond's bulletproof, Bo continued. Third attempt on him this year, and he walks away each time. No one's bulletproof, Schultz replied. They just haven't been shot right. The rain drummed against the windows, providing a steady backdrop to their conversation. In the next room, someone played a melancholy tune on the piano, a popular song about lost love that seemed to capture the mood of a city sliding into economic uncertainty. 2 weeks later, Schultz stood at Joey Noe's grave, the November wind cutting through his heavy overcoat. The cemetery was nearly empty, save for a few mourners at a distant burial and 2 of his men standing respectfully out of earshot. Joey had finally surrendered to his wounds on November 21st, and Schultz had spared no expense on the casket, the plot, the granite headstone. He placed a single white rose on the fresh mound of earth, remembering the night they'd celebrated their first successful hijacking of a beer shipment. How Joey had laughed, clapping him on the back, telling him this was just the beginning. Now here was the end, marked by cold stone and colder earth. You should be careful, a voice said behind him. Schultz didn't turn. He recognized Otto Berman's voice, the accountant who'd been working with their operation for the past few months. A mathematical genius with a knack for simplifying complex problems. They're watching the funeral, Otto continued. Police, reporters, probably Diamond's people too. Let them watch, Schultz replied. I've got nothing to hide. It's not about hiding, Otto said, stepping forward to stand beside him. It's about what you're showing. Schultz finally turned to face Berman. The older man's face was lined with the wisdom that comes from survival. Unlike most of Dutch's associates, Otto had never carried a gun. His weapon was his mind, his ability to track money, launder it, multiply it. And what am I showing, Otto? Grief, Otto said simply. In our business, that's like blood in the water. Schultz nodded slowly. Otto was right. Emotion was vulnerability. But this wasn't just any loss, this was Joey. Diamond thinks he's won something, Schultz said quietly. He hasn't. No, Otto agreed. He's just bought himself time. And you know what I always say about time? It's worth more than money, but you can't bank it, Schultz finished for him. Otto smiled thinly. Get some rest, Arthur. Tomorrow we start planning. In a well-appointed apartment overlooking Central Park, Arnold Rothstein adjusted his cufflinks and gazed out at the November lights of the city. At 46, he still carried himself with the same easy confidence that had made him a legend in New York's underworld. He'd built his fortune on gambling, loans, and an uncanny ability to connect the right people at the right time. When the knock came at his door, he checked his watch. Right on time. He appreciated punctuality. Come in, George, he called out. George McManus entered, nodding respectfully. Evening, AR game set up in the back room. Everyone's arrived. High stakes tonight, Rothstein asked, though he already knew the answer. As requested, McManus confirmed. The businessman from Chicago brought the cash you asked for. Rothstein nodded, satisfied. The poker game had been arranged carefully, each player selected for what they brought to the table, not just money but information, connections. It was how Rothstein operated, turning even recreation into opportunity. As they walked toward the game room, McManus cleared his throat. "There's talk about the Schultz situation." Rothstein paused. "What kind of talk?" "He's making noise about you backing Diamond in that ambush last month. Noe finally died yesterday." "I'd never backed Diamond," Rothstein replied evenly, "and Schultz knows it. I've done business with both of them." "Grief makes men see things that aren't there," McManus observed. "Grief makes men dangerous," Rothstein corrected. "Remind our friends to be careful with their words tonight. I don't need rumors reaching the wrong ears." McManus nodded, understanding the instruction. Rothstein straightened his tie, composing himself before entering the room where 6 men waited around the green felt table. He'd built his reputation on being the smartest man in any room. Tonight would be no different. "Gentlemen," he greeted them, "shall we begin?" 6 days later, Schultz sat in his car outside an apartment building on Park Avenue, rain pattering softly against the windshield. The newspaper on the seat beside him carried the headline that had shocked the city: "Arnold Rothstein shot after gambling dispute." According to the reports, Rothstein had been found stumbling through the service entrance of the Park Central Hotel with a bullet in his abdomen on November 4th. He'd refused to identify his shooter before succumbing to his wounds 2 days later. Bo Weinberg sat beside Schultz watching the building's entrance. "Papers are saying it was over a poker debt, that he refused to pay because he thought the game was fixed." Schultz didn't respond immediately, his gaze fixed on the rain-blurred lights of passing cars. "Convenient timing," he finally said. Bo glanced at him. "You think someone will make the connection?" "They always look for connections," Schultz replied. "Doesn't mean they'll find them." The ambiguity hung between them. Bo had disappeared for several hours the night Rothstein was shot. He'd returned with no explanation, and Schultz had asked for none. Some questions were better left unasked. "Diamond will be nervous now," Schultz continued. "His protection's gone." "If Rothstein was his protection," Bo pointed out. "Either way," Schultz said, starting the car, "we proceed as planned, one problem at a time." As they pulled away from the curb, Schultz caught a glimpse of the police detective standing in the building's doorway, watching their car disappear into the rainy night. New York was changing. The crash of '29 was still a year away, but something in the city's rhythm had already shifted. Money was tighter, tempers shorter. Territory that once seemed secure now required constant defense. The winter of 1929 gave way to spring, then summer, as the country slid further into economic uncertainty. Wall Street's crash in October sent shockwaves through every level of society, but strangely, Prohibition enterprises flourished. As legitimate businesses folded, speakeasies remained packed with people drinking to forget their troubles. Schultz expanded his operations methodically, consolidating power in the Bronx while eyeing new opportunities. The loss of Joey Noe had changed him in ways visible only to those closest to him. Where once he might have laughed easily, now he calculated. Where he might have boasted, now he observed. By October 1930, Jack Diamond had survived several more attempts on his life, earning the nickname Clay Pigeon for his uncanny ability to absorb bullets and recover. His continued existence was an irritation Schultz couldn't abide, a loose end that needed tying. "We have his location," Landau reported one evening as they sat in the back of Schultz's favorite restaurant, Hotel Monticello. "He's been there 3 days now." Schultz cut into his steak, the knife slicing cleanly through the rare meat. "Security?" "Minimal. He's getting sloppy, overconfident." "Or setting a trap," Bo suggested. "Either way," Schultz said, echoing his words from a year before, "it ends now." Later that night, 2 men in dark overcoats walked calmly through the Hotel Monticello's lobby, nodded to the night clerk, and took the elevator to the 4th floor. What happened next would be reported in every newspaper across the city. Gunmen forced their way into Diamond's room and shot him 5 times at close range. What the papers couldn't report, because no one knew, was how Schultz received the news the following morning. He was having breakfast when Landau called. "It's done," Landau said, "but he's still alive." Schultz set down his coffee cup carefully. "Explain." 5 shots. Point blank. He walked out into the hallway afterward, collapsed in front of the police commissioner, told them he'd had 2 shots of whiskey before they got him to the hospital. There was a long silence. Then Schultz laughed, a sound so unexpected that his housekeeper, dusting in the next room, nearly dropped a vase. "Of course he did," Schultz said, shaking his head. "Maybe he is bulletproof after all." The spring of 1931 found Schultz at the height of his power. His beer distribution network controlled the Bronx and parts of Manhattan. His policy banks took in thousands daily from Harlem's numbers players. Politicians knew his name, and cops knew to look the other way when his trucks rolled through their precincts. But fame brought scrutiny. In a particularly public incident, Schultz became involved in a brawl at a speakeasy that left gangster Charles Chink Sherman dead from gunshot wounds. Despite witnesses, despite evidence, despite the growing public outcry against gangland violence, Schultz was acquitted at trial. Outside the courthouse, reporters shouted questions as Schultz descended the steps with his attorneys. "Mr. Fleckenheimer, how does it feel to walk free? Any comment on the Sherman shooting? Are you concerned about further investigations?" Schultz paused, straightened his tie, and gave them a measured smile. "Justice was served today. I'm an honest businessman being persecuted by false accusations. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have enterprises to attend to." As he slid into the back seat of his waiting car, Otto Berman gave him an approving nod. Short and sweet. "The papers will love it." "The papers can go to hell," Schultz replied, though without heat. "What's the situation with our friend upstate?" Otto knew immediately he meant Diamond, who had somehow survived yet another assassination attempt and was now facing kidnapping charges in Albany. "Trial's wrapping up," Otto said. "Word is he'll walk. Prosecution's case is falling apart." Schultz stared out the window at the city streets. Nearly 3 years had passed since Joey Noe died in that hospital bed. 3 years of careful planning, of building power, of waiting for the right moment. "Then we finish it," he said simply. December 18th, 1931. Albany, New York. Snow fell gently on the state capitol, transforming the streets into quiet pathways between glowing windows. In a modest rooming house on Dub Street, Jack Legs Diamond celebrated his acquittal on kidnapping charges with whiskey and friends. The man they couldn't kill was feeling invincible. By 4003 in the morning, Diamond lay alone in his room, deep in drunken sleep. He didn't hear the door open, didn't see the 3 men who entered silently, their breath fogging in the cold room, didn't feel the pillow being adjusted beneath his head. The first bullet entered his skull above his right ear. The second and third followed in quick succession. After 3 years of miraculous escapes, Jack Diamond had finally run out of lives. 200 miles away, Dutch Schultz sat alone in his study, a glass of whiskey untouched on the desk before him. When the telephone rang, he let it sound 3 times before answering. "Yes." The voice on the other end was brief. "It's done." Schultz hung up without replying. He reached for a framed photograph on his desk, himself and Joey Noe standing outside their first brewery, arms around each other's shoulders, young faces full of ambition. He studied it for a long moment, then returned it to its place. Outside, the winter wind whistled through bare tree branches. The Depression had tightened its grip on the city. Bread lines stretched around corners, and former businessmen sold pencils on street corners. Yet in certain circles, money still flowed. Power still accumulated. The game continued. Schultz finally reached for his whiskey, raised it in a silent toast to the empty room, and drank. One chapter closed, but in this business there was always another page waiting to be turned. The snow continued to fall outside his window, covering the city in a temporary peace while Dutch Schultz contemplated his next move in a war that never truly ended. The winter of 1932 settled over New York City like a heavy wool blanket, cold and unyielding. Snow fell in the afternoon, dusting the streets with a deceptive purity that would soon turn to grey slush under the tires of passing automobiles. In his Park Avenue apartment, Dutch Schultz stood by the window, watching the flakes swirl in the amber glow of street lamps. A glass of whiskey, the good kind, not the bathtub variety his operation sold to the common folk, rested in his hand, untouched. "They're saying Cole's getting restless," said Bo Weinberg, lounging in a leather armchair behind him. Bo was a large man with calculating eyes and hands that could be gentle when counting money and merciless when wrapped around a gun. Dutch didn't turn from the window. The city looked different to him now that Leg's diamond was gone, now that Noe was buried. The underworld had recognized his authority, bowed to it, all except one. "Vincent always was restless," Dutch replied, his voice quiet but edged with steel. "Ever since we were kids, never could sit still in class." The relationship between Dutch and Vincent Cole had once been simple. Cole had been a hitman, a boyhood friend from the old neighborhood who did what he was told for a decent price. But after Noe's death, something had changed in Cole. Ambition had taken root like a weed, choking out loyalty. "It's more than restless, Dutch. He wants to be partners now." Bo leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. "Equal partners." Dutch finally turned, his face a careful mask. "There are no equal partners in this business. There's me and there's everybody else." Outside, car horns blared through the muffling snow. The depression had made the city desperate. Men who once had respectable jobs now sold apples on street corners, their fingers blue with cold. Soup kitchens had lines that stretched around blocks, and Hoovervilles dotted vacant lots like shabby makeshift villages. In this climate, the gangland violence had taken on a more reckless quality. Men with nothing to lose fought differently than men with everything to gain. "Cole's gone wild," Bo continued. "That business at the speakeasy on 107th. Dutch raised a hand, silencing him. Everyone knew what had happened. Cole and his boys had sprayed bullets into a crowded speakeasy, supposedly aiming for a rival. 5 children had been wounded. 1 had died. The papers had dubbed him Mad Dog Cole, and for once the newspaper's penchant for dramatic nicknames seemed appropriate. "He was acquitted," Dutch said flatly. "It wasn't a defense, it was a statement of fact, of the world they lived in. A world where money and fear could bend justice until it snapped. Then got pinched again for carrying. You put up his bond, 10 grand. Bo's tone held a question, perhaps wondering why Dutch would extend such a courtesy to a man showing such disloyalty. Dutch swirled the amber liquid in his glass, watching it catch the light. "I did." "And he skipped town. Took your money with him." "Yes." Dutch's response was quiet, contemplative. What Bo didn't say, what he didn't need to say, was that Cole had then begun a new enterprise, kidnapping underworld figures and demanding ransom from their bosses. It was brazen, even for a man with Cole's reputation. And then Peter Cole, Vincent's brother, had been gunned down. Vincent blamed Dutch, though Dutch had never claimed responsibility. In the shifting sands of gangland allegiances, attribution was often more about perception than fact. "He's coming for you, Dutch. Word is, he's building a crew." Dutch finally took a sip of his whiskey, feeling it burn a warm path down his throat. Let him come. The days that followed carried a strange tension, like the moment before a lightning strike. Dutch went about his business meeting with his lieutenants, visiting his beer distributors, checking on the numbers runners who worked his territory, but with a new wariness. He traveled with more men, kept his routines unpredictable. One evening in late January, Dutch sat in the back room of a small Italian restaurant on Mulberry Street with Oni Madden. Madden was Irish, like Dutch but older, with a face that looked carved from weather-beaten stone. He controlled his corner of the city with a quiet efficiency that Dutch admired. "Cole's becoming a problem for both of us," Madden said, dabbing his lips with a napkin after finishing a plate of linguine with clam sauce. "My sources tell me he's planning something for the Commonwealth Avenue operation." Dutch nodded slowly. He maintained a small headquarters in an apartment there, where some of his men would gather for regular card games. It wasn't his main base of operations, but it was important enough. When? Dutch asked. Soon. Within the week. Dutch considered this information. Cole was unpredictable, violent in a way that lacked the business sense Dutch prided himself on. There was money to be made in bootlegging, in the numbers, in protection, but only if you maintained a certain order. Cole's chaos threatened that order. I appreciate the information, Oni. Madden waved away the thanks. We've got common interests here. Cole's not just your problem. He's kidnapped 3 of my associates in the past month. The 2 men finished their meal in contemplative silence, occasionally breaking it to discuss the coming end of Prohibition. Roosevelt was likely to win the election later that year, and he'd made no secret of his intention to repeal the Volstead Act. The beer and liquor that had made men like Dutch and Madden wealthy would soon flow legally again. We'll need to diversify, Madden said, as if reading Dutch's thoughts. Find new revenue streams. Dutch nodded. He'd already been thinking about the numbers game in Harlem, a lottery system that could generate steady income, regardless of prohibition status. But that was a concern for tomorrow. Tonight there was Cole. The attack came on February 1st, just as Madden had predicted. Dutch wasn't at the Commonwealth Avenue apartment. He'd made sure to be elsewhere, dining with a judge who was on his payroll. But he received the call within minutes of the shooting. They hit the card game. Bo's voice crackled over the telephone line. 3 dead. Emily Torrizello caught a stray bullet. She was just visiting her cousin in the building. Dutch closed his eyes briefly. Collateral damage. An innocent woman. It wasn't good business. It wasn't good for keeping the police at a manageable distance. And Cole? Dutch asked. Wasn't there. Must have gotten delayed. His boys did the shooting. Dutch hung up without another word. The innocent bystander complicated matters. This, combined with the Mad Dog incident where a child had died, would bring heat. The kind of heat that could scorch everyone, not just Cole. He wasn't surprised when he heard, through his police contacts, that the commissioner had issued a shoot-to-kill order for any officer who encountered Vincent Cole. The public was outraged, and the police needed to be seen doing something. Cole had become a liability to everyone in the underworld, a fire burning too hot and too visible. For the next week, Dutch increased security everywhere. His men carried extra weapons, traveled in pairs at minimum. Cole was in hiding somewhere in the city, and the cornered animal was always the most dangerous. On February 8th, Dutch was in his office above a legitimate laundry business he owned on the east side when the telephone rang. It was Oni Madden. Cole just called me, Madden said without preamble. He's demanding $50,000 or he says he'll kidnap my brother-in-law. Dutch sat forward in his chair. Where is he? We're tracing the call. He's in a drugstore using their phone. London Chemist on West 23rd. There was a pause. I'm keeping him talking. Dutch didn't hesitate. Bo's 5 minutes from there. I'll send him. He hung up and immediately dialed another number. When Bo answered, Dutch gave him the location and a simple instruction. End it. Bo didn't ask questions. He never did. Dutch replaced the receiver and leaned back in his chair, feeling a strange calm settle over him. Outside his window, the city continued its daily rhythms, unaware of the quiet machinations that directed the flow of money, alcohol, and blood through its streets. Later, Bo would tell him how it happened. The dark limousine pulling up to the London Chemist's drugstore, Bo entering alone, Thompson's submachine gun concealed under his long coat, the few customers in the store, the pharmacist behind the counter, Bo's calm instruction, keep cool folks. Then the glass phone booth where Vincent Cole stood with the receiver to his ear, his back to the store, still talking to Madden. The Thompson made its distinctive rattling sound, like fabric tearing, glass shattered. Cole crumpled inside the booth, 15 bullets finding their mark. He was 23 years old. Bo and the others were gone before the pharmacist could reach for the telephone. When Dutch received confirmation that the job was done, he sat alone in his office for a long time. Vincent Cole had once been a friend, a neighborhood kid who'd run the same streets Dutch had. Now he was a problem that had been solved permanently. The following day, Dutch instructed one of his men to send a floral wreath to Cole's funeral. Attached was a banner with 3 simple words, "From the boys." It was part sentiment, part warning to others who might consider the path Cole had taken. With Diamond gone and now Cole, Dutch stood unchallenged at the pinnacle of New York's underworld. The newspapers began referring to him as the undisputed beer baron of the city. But even as he cemented his position, Dutch could see the landscape shifting beneath him. Prohibition wouldn't last forever. Roosevelt was gaining popularity, promising a new deal for the American people, and that deal included legal alcohol. In late February, Dutch called a meeting of his closest associates at a restaurant he owned in the Bronx. The place was closed to the public for the evening, and his men had swept it for listening devices earlier in the day. Around a large round table sat Bo Weinberg, Otto Berman, a numbers wizard Dutch had recently brought into his organization, and several other trusted lieutenants. Prohibition's ending, Dutch said without preamble. Maybe not this year, but soon. We need to be ready. We've still got the unions, said one of the men. Protection rackets. Dutch nodded, but his mind was elsewhere. I've been looking at Harlem. The numbers game there is bringing in steady money, but it's fragmented. Small-time operators running their own territories. Otto Berman, a heavy-set man with a mathematician's mind, leaned forward. I've done some calculations. If we consolidated those operations, streamlined them, we could triple the current take. Exactly, Dutch said, pointing at Otto. We need to think bigger, more organized. The beer business taught us about distribution, collection, protection. We apply those same principles to the numbers in Harlem. The local boys won't give up their territories without a fight, Bo pointed out. Dutch's expression hardened slightly. Then they'll get a fight, but I'd prefer to offer them a business proposition first. Join us, keep a percentage, but acknowledge who's in charge. The men around the table nodded. Dutch had eliminated his rivals and consolidated his power. Now he would use that power to ensure his organization's survival in the changing times ahead. As the meeting concluded and the men filed out into the cold February night, Dutch remained seated at the table. The restaurant was quiet now, just the soft ticking of a clock on the wall and the distant sounds of the city filtering in from outside. He thought about Vincent Cole, about how quickly a friend could become an enemy in their world, about how tenuous power could be, how it needed to be constantly reinforced, constantly demonstrated. The wreath he'd sent to Cole's funeral had been more than a taunt. It had been a message to everyone in the underworld, cross Dutch Schultz, and this is where you end up. But as he sat alone in the dimly lit restaurant, Dutch also thought about adaptation. The streets had taught him to be ruthless, but they'd also taught him to be nimble. When Prohibition ended, and it would, he would be ready. The numbers game in Harlem would become his new empire, just as organized and profitable as his beer operation had been. Outside, snow began to fall again, covering the city in a fresh blanket of white. By morning, it would be grey with soot and dirt, trampled under thousands of feet. But for now, in this moment, it looked clean and new. Dutch Schultz finished his drink and stood up, ready to step out into the changing world. Harlem breathed differently after midnight. The night air carried the fading melodies of late jazz clubs, where performers had loosened their bow ties and played the slower numbers that invited reflection. The streets, still glistening from an evening rain, reflected the amber glow of street lamps. Even in 1932, with the Depression's cold fingers wrapped around the city's throat, this neighborhood kept its own particular rhythm. Dutch Schultz stood at the window of his temporary office, a converted apartment above a tailor shop on 125th Street. His silhouette remained still against the backdrop of Harlem's late-night landscape. The only movement came from the smoke of his cigarette, rising in lazy curls before dispersing into the darkness of the room. At 31, Arthur Flegenheimer, the man who had fully become Dutch Schultz, was entering a new phase of his ambitions. The numbers, he said quietly to the 3 men seated behind him. That's where we're going. He turned from the window, revealing a face that seemed caught between boyishness and hardened experience. His eyes, however, left no confusion about which side was winning. Otto Berman adjusted his glasses, the lamplight catching their thick lenses. At 53, Abadaba was older than the others, with thinning hair and the stooped posture of a lifetime spent hunched over calculations. "I've been studying the pattern," Berman said, his voice carrying the thoughtful precision that had earned him Schultz's rare respect. "The numbers game has mathematical vulnerabilities we can exploit. It's beautiful, actually, the way probability becomes predictable in large samples." Schultz slid into the chair behind his desk, suddenly animated by Berman's analysis. "Prohibition's dying," he said flatly. "Roosevelt's going to kill it by next year. We need new rivers, not new boats." Jules Modzelewski, Julie Martin to most, nodded. As one of Schultz's most trusted lieutenants, he understood the urgency better than most. Harlem's numbers racket brings in thousands every day. Small bets, but they add up. Holstein and the Queen have had it locked for years. "Had it locked," Schultz corrected, emphasizing the past tense. Abe Landau, leaning against the wall with his arms folded, frowned slightly. "St. Clair has connections. She's not going to roll over." Schultz smiled, though it never quite reached his eyes. Neither did Legs Diamond. The room fell quiet at the mention of the name. It had been less than 2 years since Jack Legs Diamond had been found with 3 bullets in his head in an Albany rooming house. Though nothing had ever been proven, everyone in the room knew what had happened to those who stood in Schultz's path. "This is different," Berman said, breaking the silence. "Diamond was a direct confrontation. The numbers game is an institution up here. It's like trying to take over a church." Schultz leaned forward. "Then we'll become religious men." He paused, his fingers drumming briefly on the desktop. "Jim Hines says the time is right. Tammany wants a more organized approach to Harlem. We provide that, they provide cover." "The police?" Martin asked. "Already arranged through Hines. We'll have selective enforcement. Her banks get raided, ours don't." Berman pulled a small notebook from his jacket pocket, opened it, and placed it on the desk. "The key is controlling which numbers hit. Most banks can't sustain a payout on heavily played numbers. If we can predict or manipulate the sources, racetrack handles, bank clearinghouse totals, we control not just collection but payouts." Schultz studied the notebook, filled with Berman's precise figures and probability calculations. There was something reassuring about the mathematics, the sense that chaos could be tamed by numbers on a page. Dutch had always believed that the world, properly managed, could be made to behave according to plan. "Beautiful," Schultz murmured, then looked up. "Who's Bumpy Johnson?" "Queen's enforcer," Landau answered. "Smart, connected, respected. Did time upstate but kept his mouth shut. If we're going to have trouble, it'll come through him." Schultz nodded, absorbing the information. "And this Bub Hewlett, the one Hines mentioned." "Local talent," Martin said. "Knows every policy bank in Harlem, could be useful as a front man." "Bring him in," Schultz decided. "We need faces that blend in up here." The autumn night deepened around the building as they continued their planning, mapping out a conquest not of territory but of an economic system, one that had evolved organically in a community where traditional banks had failed both literally during the crash and figuratively through decades of discrimination. 3 weeks later, Stephanie St. Clair sat in the back room of a small restaurant on Lenox Avenue, her posture impeccable despite the weight pressing down on her shoulders. At 46, the woman known throughout Harlem as Madam Queen carried herself with the dignified authority that had made her not just successful but respected. A rare combination for anyone in her position, let alone a black woman in America. Across from her sat Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson, his broad shoulders and impassive expression giving little hint of the strategic mind behind his enforcer's reputation. "They hit 3 more banks yesterday," Johnson said, keeping his voice low despite the privacy of their location. "Webster Avenue, 14 Fifth Street, and the one near the Apollo. Same pattern. Police come in with warrants, arrest the bankers, seize the slips and money. Sinclair's eyes narrowed. And Schultz's operations? Untouched, not even a traffic ticket. She placed her teacup down with deliberate control. This Dutchman thinks he can simply walk in and take what we've built, as if we're children playing a game he can interrupt. It's not just muscle, Johnson observed. It's a system. Police, bondsmen, judges. When our people get arrested, they stay locked up. His people are back on the street before the ink dries. Sinclair understood the implications perfectly. She had navigated the treacherous waters of Harlem's underground economy for over a decade, building her policy banks into an operation that employed hundreds and processed thousands of daily bets. The numbers game wasn't just business. It was an alternative financial system for a community often excluded from legitimate banking. We need to fight differently, she said after a moment of contemplation. If they use the law as a weapon, we'll expose them in the light. Johnson raised an eyebrow. The newspapers? The Amsterdam News for certain. And I've been keeping records, every payment to every officer, every badge number, every transaction. I'll testify before the Seabury Commission. That's dangerous, Johnson cautioned. Those cops won't appreciate having their names in print. More dangerous than doing nothing, Sinclair countered. This isn't just about me or you, Bumpy. This is about who controls Harlem's economy. If Schultz takes the numbers, he takes everything. Outside, a light rain had begun to fall, softening the sounds of evening traffic. In apartments throughout the neighborhood, families gathered around dinner tables discussing the day's struggles and small victories. In doorways and on stoops, runners collected small folded papers with numbers and coins, the daily ritual of hope that had become as much a part of Harlem life as church on Sundays. I hear he's brought in some mathematical genius, Johnson said, an older Jewish man who can calculate odds in his head. St. Clair smiled thinly. Mathematics doesn't change loyalty. Our players know us, they trust us to pay when they hit. Schultz is an outsider. He's hiring local faces. A man named Hewlett is recruiting for him, offering protection and steady percentages. The Queen's expression darkened. Bob Hewlett, she said, the name sounding like an indictment, always looking for the easier path. As they continued their conversation, neither noticed the sedan parked across the street, or the two men inside watching the restaurant entrance with patient attention. Otto Berman spread the papers across the table in Schultz's downtown office. Unlike the temporary Harlem location, this space in the financial district spoke of permanence and legitimacy, leather furniture, oak panels, discreet telephone lines. It's all about controlling the action, Berman explained, pointing to columns of numbers. Most policy banks set the odds at 600 to 1, but the true odds are 1,000 to 1. That's their margin. But when certain numbers are heavily played, birthdays, holidays, numbers from dreams, a hit can wipe out a small bank. Schultz, unusually focused, studied the figures, and you can predict which numbers will be played heavy. Better than that, Berman said, his voice carrying quiet pride. I can influence which numbers win. Dutch looked up, his interest visibly sharpened. The winning number comes from public sources. Racetrack handles, stock figures, bank clearinghouse totals. With the right people in place, we can control those sources or get advance information. We pay out on the numbers we choose. Schultz leaned back, a rare, genuine smile crossing his face. Abba Dabba, he said, using Berman's nickname, you're worth more than an army. An army gets attention, Berman replied mildly. Numbers are quiet. The telephone rang, and Schultz lifted the receiver. Yeah? His expression shifted as he listened, the momentary warmth replaced by something cooler. When? Another pause. Keep watching. No moves until I say. He returned the receiver to its cradle and turned to Berman. The Queen is meeting with newspaper people. Amsterdam News. Berman removed his glasses, polishing them thoughtfully. She's going public. She's already running advertisements naming corrupt officers, Schultz said, and now she's talking to the Seabury Commission. That complicates matters. Schultz stood and walked to the window. Below, Wall Street continued its anxious commerce, men in suits hurrying between buildings as if perpetual motion could stave off the depression's gravity. Hines warned me she might try this, Schultz said. He says not to worry, the cop she paid will deny everything and he'll believe her over them. But I don't like noise. What about Johnson? Berman asked. He's different. Smart, calculating. If we push too hard on the Queen, we deal with him next. Berman replaced his glasses. Perhaps we should consider a different approach. I'm listening. In mathematics, there's rarely just one solution to a problem. Direct confrontation creates resistance. Absorption can be more efficient. Schultz turned from the window. What are you suggesting? The Queen and Johnson have what we lack, community trust. We have what they lack, political protection and capital. Perhaps instead of destroying their operation, we incorporate it. For a moment, Schultz was silent, weighing the suggestion against his natural inclination toward dominance. Finally, he nodded slowly. Set up a meeting with Lucky, he said. He understands how to structure these things. The winter of 1932 settled over Harlem with particular cruelty. As Christmas approached, the economic hardship that had gripped the nation since the crash seemed to tighten its hold. Bread lines grew longer, apartments colder, and the distance between survival and catastrophe shortened for countless families. In this atmosphere, the numbers game took on even greater significance. For many, the daily ritual of placing a bet represented not just a gambling chance, but a form of economic prayer, a nickel or dime invested in the possibility of transformation. Dutch Schultz, now a regular presence in Harlem despite maintaining his Bronx and downtown bases, understood this reality better with each passing week. The numbers weren't just money, they were faith. It's changing, he remarked to Jules Martin as they drove slowly down 7th Avenue, now officially renamed Adam Clayton Powell Jr. Boulevard, though few used the new name. The players are more desperate, betting their last coins. Martin nodded. They see someone hit for $60 on a dime bet, it gives them hope. Hope is expensive, Schultz said, watching a group of men huddled around a trash can fire. Abadaba says players are choosing numbers from soup kitchen addresses, eviction dates, relief check numbers. Their car stopped outside a barbershop that served as one of Schultz's collection points. Unlike the speakeasies of his Prohibition empire, these locations were ordinary businesses. Barbershops, newsstands, shoeshine parlors, luncheonettes, places woven into the daily fabric of neighborhood life. Inside, the familiar sounds of scissors, electric clippers, and casual conversation created a normal backdrop for the quiet commerce happening at the back counter, where a young man recorded numbers on small slips, exchanging them for coins. The barber, a heavy-set man named Wilson, greeted Schultz with cautious respect. Mr. Schultz didn't expect you today. Just checking in, Dutch replied, his eyes taking in the details of the operation. How's business? Steady. Folks still play, even when they can't afford a haircut. Schultz nodded, then lowered his voice. Any trouble? Any of the Queen's people come around? Wilson shook his head. Not lately. Things have been quiet since Thanksgiving. As they left the barbershop, Schultz seemed pensive. It's too quiet, he said to Martin. Something's changing. Later that afternoon, in a small restaurant in the Italian section of East Harlem, Schultz sat across from Lucky Luciano. At 35, Luciano had emerged as the most sophisticated of the new generation of crime leaders, a man who understood that the future belonged not to street fighters but to corporate thinkers. The Queen is smart, Luciano observed, sipping espresso. She knows she can't win a direct war, but she's still got influence. She's been quiet lately, Schultz said. Pulled back her newspaper campaign. Because she's planning, not surrendering. My sources say she's been talking to Johnson about finding a middle path. Schultz's expression remained neutral, though his interest was clearly piqued. What kind of middle path? A structured partnership, Luciano replied. She knows the game has changed, but she also knows her worth. I don't share territories, Schultz said flatly. Luciano smiled slightly. Not territories, Dutch. Functions. The numbers game is more complex than bootlegging. It needs collection, Accounting, payouts, protection, judicial influence. Each piece has value. And you think I should let them keep a piece? I think you should consider what serves the larger goal. Complete destruction creates vacuums. Structured incorporation creates stability. Schultz was quiet for a moment, turning his coffee cup slowly between his fingers. Berman suggested something similar. Abadaba's a smart man, Luciano said. He sees patterns. Outside, snow had begun to fall, soft white flakes descending on a city struggling to maintain its dignity against economic collapse. Christmas decorations hung in windows, somehow more poignant for their attempts at normalcy. Set it up, Schultz finally said. A meeting with Johnson, just him, not the Queen. Luciano nodded, understanding the significance. I'll arrange it, neutral ground. The meeting took place 3 days after Christmas, in a private room above a restaurant in Midtown territory that belonged to neither Harlem nor the Bronx. Bumpy Johnson arrived alone, dressed impeccably in a dark suit that accentuated his powerful build. He carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man accustomed to navigating dangerous waters. Schultz, already seated at the table with Berman beside him, studied Johnson as he entered. Here was a man who had spent much of his life in Harlem, yet had also survived 7 years in Sing Sing without breaking. Dutch recognized something in Johnson's composed demeanor, a similar understanding that power came not just from violence, but from strategic patience. Mr. Johnson, Schultz said, gesturing to the empty chair, thank you for coming. Johnson took the seat, his expression revealing nothing. Mr. Schultz, Mr. Berman, you know Abadaba? By reputation, Johnson replied. A man who understands numbers. Berman smiled slightly at the recognition. The language of the universe, he said. A waiter entered with coffee, then departed discreetly, closing the door behind him. For a moment, the only sound was the gentle clink of cups against saucers. I'll be direct, Schultz said. The numbers war is costly for everyone. Police attention, lost revenue, disrupted operations. There might be a more efficient arrangement. Johnson's expression remained measured. I'm listening. We have what you need: political protection, capital, influence with the authorities. You have what we need: community trust, established collection networks, local knowledge. And Madame St. Clair, Johnson asked. She retains a position of respect, Schultz said. But the structure changes. My organization becomes the bank. The policy slips, the money, it all funnels through our operation. Berman handles the numbers, ensures fairness, manages the mathematical side. Your collectors become our collectors, but keep their territories and a percentage. Johnson sipped his coffee, his eyes never leaving Schultz's face. And enforcement? That's where you come in, Schultz said. You understand Harlem better than my men ever could. You become our liaison. The man who ensures smooth operations, settles disputes, maintains order. The persuader, Berman added quietly. Johnson set down his cup. And if we refuse? Then the war continues, Schultz replied without emotion. More raids, more arrests, more pressure. Eventually, the outcome will be the same, but the cost will be higher for everyone, especially the community. The implied threat hung in the air between them, not as crude intimidation, but as cold business calculus. Johnson was silent for a long moment, weighing options that had been narrowing for months. Finally, he spoke. I'll discuss your proposal with Madame St. Clair. Of course, Schultz said, but understand, this is the best offer you'll receive. Luciano and others agree it's a reasonable accommodation. As the meeting concluded and Johnson departed, Berman turned to Schultz. He'll take it to her, but he already knows the answer. You sound certain, Schultz observed. It's mathematics, Berman replied simply. When all variables are considered, there's only one rational solution. By early 1933, the transformation was complete. Dutch Schultz had become the effective ruler of Harlem's numbers racket, not through total destruction, but through calculated absorption. The collection points remained largely the same. Many of the same faces still took the bets, but the flow of money had changed direction. On a cold February evening, Schultz stood in his Harlem office, now permanently established and properly furnished. On the wall hung a large map of the neighborhood, marked with collection points, accounting offices, and enforcement territories. It resembled nothing so much as a military campaign map, which, in many ways, it was. Final figures for January, Berman said, placing a ledger before him. Nearly 30% increase over December. The system is stabilizing. Schultz nodded with satisfaction. And payouts. Controlled and strategic, we let enough legitimate hits occur to maintain confidence, but we're managing the heavy action numbers. The door opened, and Bumpy Johnson entered. Over the past weeks, an unusual working relationship had developed between the two men. Not friendship, certainly, but a form of professional respect born of pragmatic necessity. "Everything quiet?" Schultz asked. "For now," Johnson replied. "There was some trouble on 47th Street, a collector skimming. I handled it." "Handled it how?" "He won't be collecting anymore, but he'll still walk. Message delivered, no police attention." Schultz nodded approvingly. "That's what I need from you, Bumpy. Intelligence." Outside, Harlem continued its daily rhythms. In barbershops and beauty parlors, on stoops and street corners, the conversation often turned to the change in the numbers operation. Some spoke with resentment about the downtown interests taking over. Others simply adapted to the new reality. The nickels and dimes still flowed, the slip still changed hands, and occasionally someone still hit a number that transformed their fortunes, at least temporarily. For Dutch Schultz, the conquest of Harlem's numbers racket represented more than a new revenue stream to replace the dwindling profits of Prohibition. It represented evolution, from the crude violence of the beer wars to the sophisticated systems of financial extraction. With Otto Berman's mathematical genius and Bumpy Johnson's cultural fluency, he had created a machine more durable than any that relied solely on terror. As winter gave way to early spring, Schultz found himself spending more time in Harlem, studying its rhythms and flows with the same intensity he had once applied to brewery truck routes. Something about the neighborhood's resilience fascinated him, its ability to create parallel economies, alternative institutions, and cultural wealth despite systemic exclusion. "You know what I'd noticed?" he said to Berman one evening as they watched the crowds on 125th Street from their office window. "Everybody's hustling something up here. Not just the numbers. Everybody's got an angle, a side business, a scheme." "Necessity breeds innovation," Berman replied. "When traditional paths are blocked, new ones emerge." Schultz nodded slowly. "That's why the numbers work so well here. It's not just gambling, it's an alternative banking system. People who can't get loans from downtown banks can get advances against future winnings. Winners invest in small businesses, education, property." "You sound almost admiring," Berman observed with mild surprise. "I recognize good business," Schultz said, "and I recognize survival." As the conversation continued, neither man could know that their reconfigured empire, seemingly so stable, would face new challenges in the coming months. The end of Prohibition, the rise of reform politics under LaGuardia, the growing reach of federal authorities. For now, in the early months of 1933, Dutch Schultz had achieved something that seemed impossible a year earlier. He had become, in essential ways, the king of Harlem, controlling the invisible financial network that touched nearly every block and building. The numbers continued their daily dance across the neighborhood, each slip of paper carrying not just a three-digit sequence, but the weight of hope in difficult times. Hope that now yielded its profits to a new master, a man who had learned that sometimes the most effective conquest came not from destruction, but from absorption. The midnight hour had wrapped itself around Manhattan like an old woolen coat, warm but familiar. Rain tapped against the windows of the high-rise apartment on Central Park West, where Dutch Schultz stood watching the city lights blur through rivulets of water on glass. His reflection stared back at him, broken nose, hooded eyelids, the face of a man the papers couldn't stop writing about. On the mahogany side table, today's newspapers were neatly stacked. The headline screamed his name in bold black type, Schultz indicted for tax evasion. Beside them lay an open copy of Great Expectations, bookmark carefully placed where he'd left off. The gangster's fingers traced the window's cold surface. Somewhere out there, Thomas Dewey was probably still awake too, plotting his next move. The new federal prosecutor had made Dutch his project, his stepping stone to greater political ambitions. Dutch understood the game. In this new Roosevelt era, the government needed public enemies, and he had been crowned public enemy number one. They always find a way to come at you, Dutch murmured to the empty room. Not for what you've done, but for what you didn't pay on what you've done. Behind him, the telephone rang, cutting through his thoughts. He let it ring 3 times before answering, a habit born of caution. Yeah? Boss, it's Irving. The voice of his accountant was tight with tension. They're saying $92,000 in back taxes. The paperwork just came through. Dutch closed his eyes, breathing deeply. Dewey thinks he found his Al Capone case. This is serious. They've got ledgers. Ledgers can be explained. Numbers are just stories, Irving, and I've got better storytellers than Thomas Dewey. After hanging up, Dutch returned to the window. January 1933 spread before him, a city in the depths of the Depression, yet still glittering with possibility. His empire had evolved beyond bootlegging since the rumblings that Prohibition would end. Now he controlled waiters' unions, loan operations that kept desperate men afloat at painful interest rates, and nightclubs that paid for protection they couldn't afford to decline. The irony wasn't lost on him. As a boy from the Bronx who'd clawed his way up, he now lived in a world of contradictions. The same hands that had ordered beatings now turned the pages of Shakespeare. The man who ruled by fear spent evenings teaching his young son to read. The gangster whose name made men tremble had become, in the privacy of his home, a connoisseur of literature and quiet contemplation. Sleep would not come that night. By morning, Dutch had made his decision. He would disappear, but not in the way men in his profession typically did. This would be a strategic retreat. Snow fell gently over rural Connecticut, blanketing the landscape in whisper-quiet white. The farmhouse Dutch had acquired through a series of proxies stood isolated at the end of a long, winding driveway. Here, miles from Manhattan's clamor, he had established one of several hideaways. Bo Weinberg, his trusted lieutenant, arrived carrying grocery bags and newspapers. The tall, sharp-featured man stomped snow from his shoes before entering. "You're all over the papers, Dutch," he said, dropping the stack on the kitchen table. "Dewey's making speeches about bringing you to justice." Dutch looked up from the fire he was stoking. Let him talk. Every week I'm gone makes him look more incompetent. Bo unpacked the groceries methodically. Unlike some of Dutch's men, Weinberg carried himself with cool professionalism. He had been with Dutch through the gang wars of the late 20s, surviving where others hadn't. That history had forged a bond of trust between them, though Dutch knew better than to call it friendship. "The business?" Dutch asked. "Running smooth. Otto's handling the numbers, Julie's keeping the restaurant boys in line." Bo hesitated. "Though there's talk about the books not adding up in some places." Dutch's eyes narrowed slightly. "What kind of talk?" "Nothing specific, just whispers. With you gone, some people might be testing boundaries." The fire crackled, sending shadows dancing across the room. Dutch stared into the flames, his face impassive but his mind calculating. Disloyalty in his organization was like rust on machinery. Left untreated, it would spread and corrode the entire operation. "I want weekly reports on the numbers," Dutch said finally, every penny accounted for. That night, as wind moaned around the eaves of the farmhouse, Dutch wrote a letter to his wife. He described the peaceful countryside, asked about their children, and promised this separation wouldn't be forever. What he didn't write was the truth, that his absence was stretching from weeks into months, and that the waiting game with Dewey was becoming a war of attrition neither man had anticipated. After finishing the letter, he returned to his copy of King Lear, finding strange comfort in the tale of a powerful man undone by betrayal and his own misjudgments. Spring arrived in Newark, bringing with it the scent of renewal that even the industrial smoke couldn't fully mask. Dutch had moved again, this time to a modest apartment near the railway station. The constant comings and goings made him just another face in the crowd. Otto Berman, his mathematical genius and advisor, sat across from him at a small kitchen table covered with papers. The bespectacled man's fingers moved swiftly over columns of numbers, his expression one of practiced concentration. "The numbers game is holding steady," Otto reported. "Even with the economy what it is, people still find money to play. Hope comes cheap at a nickel a play." Dutch nodded. The numbers racket had become a cornerstone of his operation, particularly in Harlem where his takeover had been both profitable and contentious. And the union situation? Stable. "We're collecting dues, providing the necessary services." Otto smiled slightly, his way of acknowledging the euphemism. "But there's something else you should know about." Dutch waited, watching Otto remove his glasses and clean them with a handkerchief, a habit that usually preceded difficult news. "I've been going over Julie Martin's books from the restaurant collections. There are discrepancies, significant ones." The room seemed to grow colder. "How significant?" "About $70,000 over the past year." Dutch's expression didn't change, but Otto, who had learned to read the subtle shifts in his employer's demeanor, saw the dangerous stillness that settled over him. It was like watching ice form over deep water. "You're sure about this?" Otto nodded. "The numbers don't lie, Dutch. Not to me." Later that evening, Dutch stood by the window of his apartment, watching the Newark streets. Julie Martin, Jules Modzelewski by birth, had been with him for years, running the restaurant racket with the kind of intimidating presence that required few words. A hulking man with hands like hammers, Julie had always seemed loyal, if not particularly bright. The telephone call Dutch made was brief. A meeting would be arranged, accounts would be settled, business after all was business. The summer of 1934 had brought sweltering heat to the city. Newspaper headlines shouted about labor strikes, New Deal programs, and the continuing manhunt for Dutch Schultz. After more than a year in hiding, Dutch had begun to feel like a ghost haunting his own empire, present but unseen, powerful yet constrained. In a Newark safe house, Dutch sat with his lawyer, J. Richard Dixie Davis, reviewing options that seemed to narrow with each passing month. "Dewey's not backing down," Dixie explained, loosening his tie in the oppressive heat. "The longer you stay a fugitive, the stronger his case looks to the public. He's building a career on bringing you down." Dutch paced the small room, his customary calm fraying of the edges. "What's he got besides tax forms, numbers on paper? That's all he needs. It worked on Capone. The law doesn't care how you made the money, just that you didn't pay the government, it's cut." Dixie wiped sweat from his brow. "Dutch, I think it's time to consider surrendering on our terms. Choose the battlefield." The suggestion hung in the air like cigarette smoke. Dutch stopped pacing, studied his lawyer's face for signs of weakness or deception, finding none. "Surrender," he repeated, testing how the word felt in his mouth, bitter as aloes. "And then what?" "Then we fight, but we fight smart, not with guns, but with strategy." Dixie leaned forward. "The system has cracks, Dutch. I know how to find them." By November, the decision had been made. Dutch Schultz, public enemy number one, would surrender in Albany, not to federal authorities in New York City where Dewey waited, but to state officials on the tax charges. It was a calculated move, designed to keep him out of Dewey's immediate reach while they prepared for the inevitable trial. The surrender itself was surprisingly anticlimactic. No dramatic shootout, no last stand, just a man in a well-tailored suit walking into a government building with his lawyer. The press had a field day nonetheless, their flashbulbs capturing the contradiction that was Dutch Schultz, the broken-nosed thug who quoted Shakespeare to reporters on his way into custody. The Syracuse courtroom in early 1935 hummed with tension and expectation. Dutch sat beside Dixie Davis, his posture relaxed but alert, watching as potential jurors filed in for questioning. The government's case seemed mathematically irrefutable. a straightforward matter of income versus taxes paid. But Dutch and Dixie weren't playing a mathematical game. "Remember," Dixie murmured as they observed the jury selection process, "we're not trying to disprove the numbers. We're trying to make them see the man, not the ledger." During breaks in the proceedings, Dutch would retreat to a small consultation room where he read Dickens, the familiar prose offering respite from the legal jargon and stern faces. When reporters asked about his literary habits, he offered quips that made good copy. A man's got to improve his mind, even when the government's trying to improve his accommodations. The charm offensive extended beyond reporters. Dutch nodded respectfully to courthouse staff, remembered names, asked after families. It was performance, certainly, but one grounded in his understanding of human nature. People preferred to believe in complexity over caricature. As the trial progressed, it became clear that some jurors were reluctant to convict. Deliberations stretched from hours into days. When the jury finally returned, their announcement of a deadlock brought a carefully concealed sigh of relief from Dutch and his team. A hung jury wasn't victory, but it wasn't defeat either. Dixie moved quickly for a change of venue for the retrial, arguing successfully that Syracuse was too influenced by press coverage. The new location, Malone, a small town near the Canadian border, was exactly what they had hoped for. Malone, Dutch said thoughtfully on the drive upstate. Population? About 6,000, Dixie replied. Rural, conservative, religious, perfect. In Malone, Dutch Schultz orchestrated what would become his masterpiece of social engineering. He rented rooms at the local hotel and immediately set about becoming the town's most generous visitor. He attended church services, making conspicuous donations. He bought new jerseys for the local baseball team. He held dinners for townspeople at the hotel, where his natural charisma and rough humor made him seem more like a visiting businessman than a notorious gangster. Children in Malone soon learned that the well-dressed stranger gave out shiny quarters for simple greetings. Shopkeepers found him to be a big tipper. At local taverns, he would buy rounds for everyone, listening to farmers' complaints about hard times with what seemed like genuine interest. Behind this performance lay careful calculation. While Dutch walked Malone's streets playing benefactor, Dixie Davis prepared their legal strategy, knowing that in this small community, impressions would matter more than evidence. The Harmony Hotel in Cohoes, near Albany, had seen better days. Its once grand lobby now showed signs of wear, the carpet thin in places, the brass fixtures dulled with age. In a private dining room on the second floor, Dutch Schultz sat with Bo Weinberg, Dixie Davis, and Jules Modzelewski, known to most as Julie Martin. The table was set with good whiskey, the kind that had once flowed through Dutch's bootlegging empire. The mood, however, was far from celebratory. Julie, his broad face flushed with alcohol and belligerence, was being questioned about the restaurant collection books. "I'm telling you, there's no missing money," Julie insisted, his voice rising. "The books are straight. Ask anyone." Dutch sipped his whiskey calmly. "Otto Berman says otherwise. And Otto doesn't make mistakes with numbers." "Then someone's feeding him bad information," Julie said, reaching for the bottle again. His hand was unsteady. "I've been loyal. Years I've been with you, Dutch. Years." Dixie Davis watched the exchange with growing discomfort. He was a lawyer, accustomed to the violence that underpinned Dutch's business, but preferring to remain at a professional distance from its execution. $70,000, Dutch said, the words falling into the room like stones. "That's what's missing, Julie. Not pocket change, not a mathematical error. 70,000. Julie's denial grew more emphatic, his voice louder, his gestures more erratic. Bo Weinberg sat silently, his eyes moving between Dutch and Julie, his hand casually positioned near his jacket pocket. The conversation circled, Julie's denials becoming repetitive, Dutch's questions more pointed. Outside, March winds rattled the windows of the old hotel, and somewhere in the building a piano played, the melody drifting faintly into the room during momentary silences. What happened next occurred with the sudden finality of a thunderclap. Julie, drunk and defiant, rose to his feet, pointing a thick finger at Dutch. "You don't appreciate loyalty anymore. You're hiding out while we do the work, and now you accuse me." The rest of his words never came. Dutch drew his pistol and fired once, the sound explosive in the closed room. Julie fell backward, a look of profound surprise frozen on his face as he collapsed to the floor. Silence followed, broken only by the distant piano and the soft tick of a clock on the mantel. Dutch returned the pistol to his pocket and looked at Bo. "Make it look like someone else's work," he said quietly. "Knives, a snowbank. Make sure he's found, but not connected to us." Dixie Davis sat rigid, his legal mind already calculating the implications, the risk, the necessary distance that must be established between this moment and any future investigations. Bo nodded, his face impassive, already planning the details of disposal. Later that night, as Dutch rode back to Malone, he watched the winter landscape pass outside the car window. The killing of Julie Martin wasn't simply punishment for theft. It was a message to anyone else in his organization who might be testing boundaries during his absence. In the underworld he inhabited, discipline required terrible clarity. Summer draped itself over Malone like a warm blanket, bringing longer days and the scent of freshly cut grass. In the town courthouse, the retrial of Dutch Schultz was approaching its conclusion. The prosecution had presented its evidence methodically. Tax forms, income estimates, witnesses to Dutch's lavish spending patterns. The mathematics were indisputable, but numbers existed in one realm and human judgment in another. Dutch sat at the defense table, appearing relaxed and attentive. He wore a modest suit, nothing flashy that might alienate the rural jurors. Throughout the trial, he had maintained his routine of public generosity in town, his visible respect for local customs and institutions. When it came time for him to testify, Dutch spoke with disarming candor about his difficult childhood, his limited education, his confusion about complex tax laws. He didn't deny his wealth, but attributed his tax situation to poor advice from accountants he had trusted. His performance was masterful, the right balance of contrition and bewilderment, never overplayed. On August 1st, 1935, the jury filed back into the courtroom after deliberations. The foreman, a local farmer with calloused hands and a serious expression, delivered their verdict, not guilty on all charges. Judge Frederick Bryant's face darkened visibly. When the courtroom had cleared, he called the jurors back before him, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. "What you have done today," he told them, "is a blow against law enforcement and the very fabric of justice. Your verdict has shaken the confidence of law-abiding citizens in our judicial system." The jurors shuffled uncomfortably under his gaze, but the verdict stood. Dutch Schultz, against mathematical certainty and federal prosecution, had walked free. That evening, as Dutch prepared to leave Malone, he stood on the porch of the hotel that had been his home during the trial. The summer twilight was settling over the small town, bringing with it the sounds of crickets and distant laughter from children playing in the lengthening shadows. He had won this battle through understanding something fundamental about human nature, that people judge with their hearts before their minds, that narratives trump numbers, and that a man who buys baseball jerseys for local children doesn't fit neatly into the role of villain, no matter what ledgers might say. Yet even in victory, Dutch felt the ground shifting beneath his feet. Dewey wouldn't stop. The world was changing. The old protections, political connections, public indifference, the code of silence, were eroding in this new era of federal power and media scrutiny. As he lit a cigarette, watching its smoke curl upward into the darkening sky, Dutch Schultz knew that freedom was relative. The trial was over, but the chase would continue. For men like him, there was always another reckoning waiting just beyond the horizon. Rain drummed steadily against the windows of the Robert Treat Hotel, creating a hypnotic rhythm that underscored the isolation of the man sitting alone at the desk. Dutch Schultz-born Arthur Flegenheimer gazed out at the Newark skyline, so close to New York, yet now a world away. The grey October afternoon cast long shadows across his suite, which had become both sanctuary and prison over the past months. He ran his finger down the column of numbers in his ledger, his brow furrowing. The figures told a story, one of diminishing returns, mounting expenses, and the slow bleeding of an empire built through years of cunning and brutality. "Mr. Schultz?" Otto Berman's voice broke the silence as the accountant entered, removing his rain-spattered hat. "I have those figures you asked for." Dutch nodded, gesturing to the chair opposite him. "Tell me something good, Otto." Berman's face remained impassive as he settled his substantial frame into the seat. "I wish I could. The legal bills from Malone, they've taken more out of our liquidity than we anticipated. And with our operations in Harlem seeing pressure." "From Luciano," Dutch finished, his voice flat. "Yes, he's been methodical about it. While you've been dealing with the courts, he's been making friends with your enemies." Dutch rose from his chair and walked to the window, watching rivulets of water trace jagged paths down the glass. The Robert Treat had become his reluctant home since Mayor LaGuardia had declared him unwelcome in New York City, a public banishment that stung more than any prison sentence. "LaGuardia says, I'll be arrested the moment I set foot in the city," Dutch said quietly, more to himself than to Berman. "Me, the man who built something out of nothing in those streets." Behind him, Otto cleared his throat. "It's temporary. The numbers racket is still producing, even with the competition. We have options." Dutch turned, a hollow smile crossing his face. "Options. That's a nice word for what we have, Otto." He returned to his desk and poured 2 fingers of whiskey into a crystal glass. "Tell me about Dewey. What's he planning next?" Berman's expression grew more serious. "He's building a case around the policy racket. Going after you for tax evasion was just his opening move. Now he's looking at the whole operation. Extortion, coercion, everything connected to Harlem. And the word from our friends in the department. They're scared, Dutch. Dewey's got federal backing now. J. Edgar Hoover himself has taken an interest. They're calling you public enemy number 1 since Capone went away." Dutch laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Public enemy. I provided jobs when there were none. I kept neighborhoods functioning when the banks closed their doors. I built something while the whole country was falling apart." The rain intensified, drumming harder against the windows. In the gathering gloom, Dutch didn't bother to turn on a lamp. The darkness suited his mood. "How much longer can we operate like this?" he asked after a long silence. Berman hesitated. 3 months, maybe 4, before our cash reserves become problematic. The policy banks are still profitable, but with increased pressure from both Luciano's people and the law. "And Dewey won't stop," Dutch said, finishing his drink. "Not until I'm in a cell next to Capone." "Or until something stops him," Berman replied carefully. The words hung in the air between them. Dutch studied his accountant's face, noting the calculated neutrality of his expression. Otto Berman hadn't survived this long by speaking carelessly. "Get Lulu and Abe up here," Dutch said finally. "We need to talk." The suite felt crowded with the arrival of Lulu Rosenkrantz and Abe Landau. Both men had been with Dutch through the ascent of his criminal career loyal soldiers, who had followed him from bootlegging to the policy rackets. They sat in uncomfortable silence as Dutch paced the room, the carpet muffling his footsteps. "Dewey," Dutch said finally, stopping near the window. "He's preparing another case. Tax evasion didn't stick, so now he's coming at us through the policy operations." Landau, always the more pragmatic of the two, frowned. "Can't we handle it like Malone? Get the trial moved somewhere friendlier?" "Different charge, different jurisdiction," Berman explained. "And our resources aren't what they were 6 months ago." Rosenkrantz shifted in his seat. "So what's the play, Dutch? We've weathered worse." Dutch turned from the window, his face partially shadowed. "Have we? The commission is watching. Luciano's people are moving in while we're pinned down by legal problems. LaGuardia's made it impossible for me to even show my face in the city." "Since when do we care what some politician says?" Landau asked. "Since the feds got involved," Dutch replied. "Since Hoover put a target on our backs. This isn't some local cop we can pay off. This is the whole system coming down on us." The room fell silent again. Outside, a siren wailed in the distance. growing fainter as it moved away through the rain-slicked streets of Newark. "There's a simple solution," Dutch said at last, his voice eerily calm. "Remove Dewey from the equation." The statement landed like a stone in still water. Berman was the first to react, clearing his throat nervously. "Dutch, that's not something to be considered lightly. Dewey isn't some rival gangster or witness we can make disappear. He's a special prosecutor, high profile." "I know exactly who he is," Dutch interrupted. "He's the man who won't stop until he destroys everything I've built. Everything we've built." His gaze swept across the faces of his lieutenants. "If he were gone, our problems would be significantly reduced." Landau leaned forward. "Dutch, hitting a prosecutor, that's different territory. The heat that would come down." "The heat is already here," Dutch snapped, slapping his hand against the desk. The sudden violence of the gesture made everyone flinch. "We're already being hunted. What's the difference if they hunt us harder?" Berman spoke carefully. "The difference is between pressure and annihilation. Kill Dewey, and they won't rest until every one of us is either dead or behind bars. It wouldn't just be LaGuardia and the feds. It would be every law enforcement agency in the country." Dutch sat heavily in his chair, his momentary anger subsiding into something colder and more calculated. "We need to bring this to the Commission. They need to understand what we're facing." "The Commission won't approve this," Berman said quietly. "They might," Dutch countered. "If they understand that Dewey is a threat to all of us, not just me. His crusade won't stop with Dutch Schultz. He'll go after Luciano next, then Lansky, all of them." The men exchanged uneasy glances. Even suggesting the assassination of a special prosecutor was unprecedented. But Dutch's expression made it clear. This wasn't merely an idea being floated, it was a plan taking shape. The meeting with the Commission was set for the following evening. In the meantime, Dutch had work to do. The policy rackets needed attention, especially with Luciano's people trying to carve away portions of his territory while he dealt with legal entanglements. Morning brought no respite from the rain, but Dutch ventured out nonetheless, with Landau and Rosenkrantz flanking him as he visited several of his operations in Newark. The collections were down, and the atmosphere in each location was tense, everyone sensing the pressure building around Schultz's organization. At a small diner near the edge of the Italian section, Dutch met with one of his policy bank managers, a nervous man named Cohen, who kept glancing toward the door as they spoke. "Numbers are down almost 30%, Cohen explained, sliding a folded piece of paper across the table. "People are nervous, Mr. Schultz. There's talk that your operation is in trouble." Dutch unfolded the paper, studied the figures, then refolded it and slipped it into his pocket. "And who's spreading this talk?" Cohen hesitated. "Luciano's people. They've been making offers to some of our collectors, better percentages, protection. They say you're finished, that it's just a matter of time before Dewey puts you away." Dutch sipped his coffee, his face betraying nothing. "Is that what they say?" "I'm just telling you what I hear, Mr. Schultz. I'm still loyal, we all are, but the collectors are getting scared." Dutch nodded slowly. "Tell them not to be. Things are about to change. Thomas Dewey won't be a problem much longer." Cohen's eyes widened slightly, but he knew better than to ask for clarification. Dutch left a generous tip on the table and departed with his men, stepping back into the dreary October morning. Back at the Robert Treat, Dutch found a message waiting from one of his contacts in the police department. Dewey had been seen meeting with federal agents the previous day. The investigation was accelerating. Time was running out. The meeting of the commission took place in a private room at a restaurant in the outskirts of Newark Neutral Ground for the gathering of the most powerful crime bosses in America. Lucky Luciano, Meyer Lansky, Louis Buchalter, Albert Anastasia, and several others sat around the table as Dutch presented his case. "Dewey won't stop with me," Dutch argued, standing at the head of the table. "He's building a reputation as the man who brings down gangsters. After me, who's next? You, Lucky, or you, Meyer?" Luciano remained impassive, smoke from his cigarette curling upward in the dim light. "We've all got problems with the law, Dutch. It's part of the business." But what you're suggesting crosses a line we don't cross. What line? Dutch demanded. We've eliminated threats before. Dewey is just another threat. He's not just another threat, Lansky interjected, his voice calm and reasonable. He's a public figure, a crusading prosecutor. Kill him, and the public outcry would be unprecedented. The government would have no choice but to come after all of us, with everything they have. They're already coming after us, Dutch countered. Not like they would if a prosecutor was murdered, Luciano said. Right now we can operate. We have our arrangements, our systems. Kill Dewey, and all of that goes away. The heat would be too much. Even our friends on the force wouldn't be able to help us. Dutch looked around the table, searching for allies, finding none. So, I'm supposed to just wait for him to destroy me, to dismantle everything I've built? You handle it like a businessman, Buchalter said. You lay low, you adapt, you survive. We've all done it. This isn't about your survival, Dutch, Anastasia added. This is about the survival of all of us. You kill Dewey, you put every operation in jeopardy. We can't allow that. Dutch's face darkened. Can't allow it. Who are you to tell me what I can and cannot do? This is my life on the line. The Commission has spoken, Luciano said firmly. The motion to eliminate Dewey is denied. Unanimously, find another way to handle your problems. Dutch looked at each man in turn, his anger barely contained. Screw you guys, he said finally, his voice low and dangerous. I'm gonna kill him anyway. I don't need your permission. He turned to leave, Landau and Rosenkrantz rising uncertainly behind him. At the door he paused and looked back at the assembled bosses. You're all making a mistake. Dewey is coming for all of us, and just the first. With that he left, the door closing heavily behind him. In the silence that followed, Luciano exchanged glances with Lansky, then with Buchalter. No words were needed, they all understood what Dutch's defiance meant. He's become a liability, Buchalter said finally, voicing what everyone was thinking. If he moves against Dewey, the consequences fall on all of us. Luciano nodded slowly. We can't allow that risk. He turned to Anastasia. Take care of it. Back at the Robert Treat, Dutch gathered his closest associates, Berman, Landau, Rosenkrantz in his suite. The rain had finally stopped, but the sky remained overcast, casting a grey pall over the city. They said no, Dutch announced without preamble. They're scared, all of them, scared of the consequences. They're right to be, Berman said cautiously. Dutch going after Dewey would be suicide. Not going after him is suicide, Dutch countered. He's going to put me away, Otto, all of us. And while I rot in prison, Luciano and the others will carve up everything we've built. Landau spoke up. The Commission doesn't give orders lightly, Dutch, defying them. I don't answer to them, Dutch interrupted. I built this organization myself. I don't need their permission to protect it. A heavy silence fell over the room. Dutch's men exchanged uneasy glances. The path their boss was choosing would put them all at risk, not just from law enforcement, but from their own colleagues in the underworld. So what's the plan? Rosenkrantz asked finally. Dutch moved to a map of New York City that was spread on his desk. Dewey lives here, he said, pointing to an Upper West Side address. He has a routine. Every morning at 7:30, he leaves his apartment and walks 3 blocks to a coffee shop. Then he takes the subway downtown. You've had him watched, Berman observed. For weeks, Dutch confirmed. We take him on the street, quick, clean, professional. Make it look like a robbery gone wrong. And then what? Landau asked. The heat that comes down. We weather it, Dutch said firmly. We've weathered storms before. But without Dewey pushing the case, we'll have room to maneuver, time to rebuild. No one pointed out the flaw in his reasoning, that Dewey's replacement would likely pursue the case even more aggressively, motivated by the murder of his predecessor, that the killing of a special prosecutor would bring down a level of law enforcement attention they had never before experienced. Instead, they listened as Dutch outlined his plan, detailing the approach, the escape route, the alibis they would establish. This was no longer the calculated businessman who had built an empire. This was a desperate man backed into a corner, seeing only one way out. As the meeting concluded, Boatman lingered behind. When they were alone, he approached Dutch, speaking softly. "This is a mistake, Dutch. You know it is." Dutch looked at his longtime advisor and accountant, seeing the genuine concern in his eyes. For a moment, his resolve wavered. "What choice do I have, Otto? Dewey won't stop. The commission won't help. What would you have me do?" "Adapt," Boatman replied simply. "Move operations further into New Jersey. Focus on the policy banks that are still producing. Scale down until the heat passes. It always does eventually." Dutch shook his head. "Not this time. Dewey's different. He doesn't want arrests or fines. He wants trophies. He wants to be the man who brought down Dutch Schultz." "Then don't be Dutch Schultz for a while," Boatman suggested. "Be Arthur Flegenheimer again. Step back, let the lieutenants run things. Give Dewey a smaller target." For a moment, Dutch seemed to consider it. Then his expression hardened. "No, I didn't build all this just to walk away from it. Dewey has to go." Boatman sighed, recognizing the finality in Dutch's tone. "Then at least be careful. The commission won't take defiance lightly." Dutch smiled thinly. "Let them come. I've been fighting all my life, Otto. I'm not about to stop now." As Boatman left the suite, Dutch returned to the window, gazing out at the Newark skyline, so tantalizingly close to the New York City skyline that was now forbidden to him. In the gathering darkness, lights began to appear in windows across the city, thousands of lives continuing. Unaware of the desperate calculations being made in a hotel suite by a man collared by the law, abandoned by his peers, and determined to fight back the only way he knew how. What Dutch couldn't know, what none of them knew, was that the commission had already reached its own decision. The survival of their entire criminal network couldn't be jeopardized by one man's desperate gamble. Even as Dutch plotted against Thomas Dewey, others were plotting against Dutch Schultz. The rain began again, softer now, a gentle percussion against the windows. Dutch watched the droplets trace their paths down the glass, each finding its inevitable way downward, pulled by forces beyond their control. Just like all of us, he thought. Just like all of us. The autumn rain fell steadily over Newark, droplets catching the amber glow of street lamps as they descended onto the slick pavement. It was the kind of evening when most folks sought shelter in the warmth of their homes, nursing hot drinks while listening to the radio crackle with news of Roosevelt's first year in office. But for Arthur Flegenheimer, better known as Dutch Schultz, there was business to be settled, and business always came first. The Palace Chop House stood like a sanctuary amid the dreary night, its windows fogged with the collective breath of patrons seeking refuge from the chill. Inside, the air hung heavy with cigarette smoke that danced lazily beneath hanging lamps, casting long shadows across tables draped in white linen. The clink of glasses and the low murmur of conversation provided a comforting blanket of anonymity for those who preferred their discussions remain private. Dutch sat at his usual table in the back room, partially hidden from the main dining area yet positioned with a clear view of the entrance. At 42, his face had hardened into a permanent map of caution, eyes that scanned rooms automatically, cataloguing faces and exits with the precision of a military strategist. His suit was impeccably tailored, a deep charcoal grey that seemed to absorb the light around him. "I don't like the numbers we're seeing from the Bronx operation," Otto Boatman murmured, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses as he reviewed the ledger before him. Known as Abadaba for his mathematical prowess, the aging accountant's fingers traced columns of figures with the reverence of a scholar examining ancient texts. Dutch nodded, taking a slow sip of whiskey. Prohibition's repeal earlier that year had changed the game dramatically. What was once their bread-and-butter bootlegging had suddenly become legitimate business. They pivoted quickly into other ventures, doubling down on the numbers racket, loan sharking, and labor union control, but the transition hadn't been seamless. "Policy slips are down 15% from last month," Otto continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "People have less to spend these days, Dutch. The depression's hitting our territories hard. People always find money for hope, Otto, Dutch replied, his voice carrying the rough edges of the Bronx streets where he'd grown up. We need to adjust the payouts. Make the dream bigger while keeping our margins. Abe Landau, Dutch's chief bodyguard, sat silently to his right, his attention split between the conversation and the restaurant's entrance. Broad-shouldered and stone-faced, Landau possessed the rare quality of appearing both invisible and intimidating simultaneously. He hadn't touched his whiskey. Bernard Lulu Rosenkrantz sat across from Landau, methodically cutting into his steak. As Dutch's driver and muscle, Lulu had a reputation for loyalty that bordered on devotion. He glanced up occasionally, his eyes meeting Landau's in silent communication, a language of protection developed over years of watching each other's backs. We should consider expanding the operation in Newark, Dutch said after a thoughtful pause. The locals are getting comfortable with us here. That's good for business. The numbers game is still fragmented in parts of the city, Otto agreed, making a notation in his ledger. Consolidation would increase efficiency. Dutch leaned back, surveying his inner circle with quiet appreciation. These men were more than associates. They were the machinery of his empire, each with their specific function, each irreplaceable in their way. Otto's mathematical genius transformed chaos into order, while Landau and Rosenkrantz provided the protective shell that allowed Dutch to operate with relative freedom. Outside, the rain intensified, drumming against the windows like impatient fingers. A distant rumble of thunder complemented the low jazz playing from the restaurant's phonograph, a melancholy tune that seemed to capture the uncertain mood of the nation as it struggled through its economic crisis. Dutch's thoughts drifted to Thomas Gilly, the ambitious young prosecutor making a name for himself in New York. Dewey had been applying pressure, investigating rackets with unprecedented vigor. Though he hadn't directly targeted Dutch yet, the winds were shifting. Law enforcement was becoming more sophisticated, better coordinated. The old ways of handling such threats, payoffs and intimidation, were losing effectiveness against this new breed of public servant. I need to use the men's room, Dutch announced, placing his napkin beside his half-eaten meal. Keep thinking about Newark, Otto. I want options when I get back. He rose from the table with the deliberate movement of a man accustomed to being watched. As he made his way through the restaurant, he nodded to familiar faces, a restaurant owner who bought liquor from them during Prohibition, a local politician whose campaign had received generous contributions. The ritual acknowledgments of a man both feared and respected in his adopted community. The men's room offered momentary solitude, a rare commodity in Dutch's world. Standing at the porcelain urinal, he allowed himself to exhale fully, releasing a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. The constant vigilance, the perpetual calculation, it wore on a man, even one as hardened as himself. The mirror above the sink reflected a face that had seen too much, done too much. Lines had formed at the corners of his eyes, etched there by years of squinting against cigarette smoke in dimly lit rooms, where decisions about life and death were made between courses. His hair, once a youthful brown, now showed traces of grey at the temples. Dutch splashed cold water on his face, a brief ritual of renewal. As he reached for a towel, he caught his own gaze in the mirror and held it, confronting himself with the same unflinching assessment he applied to others. The face that stared back was that of a survivor, a man who had crawled his way from the poverty of the Bronx to command an empire. But it was also the face of a man who understood that empires, even those built on fear and blood, were ultimately fragile constructions. He straightened his tie, adjusted his cuffs, and prepared to return to his men, to the endless calculations of profit and risk that defined his existence. The momentary vulnerability retreated behind the mask of Dutch Schultz, the name that made men lower their voices in respect or fear throughout the Northeast. Back at the table, the conversation had shifted to practicalities. We need to restructure the collection routes in Jersey City, Landau was saying as Dutch retook his seat. Too many small-timers trying to operate independent games. Makes us look weak if we let it continue. Dutch nodded, reaching for his glass. Send a message tomorrow. Nothing too messy, just enough to remind people who runs the numbers in this state. The waiter approached with fresh drinks, his movements careful and precise. Dutch noticed how the man's eyes never quite met his, the characteristic deference of those who knew enough to be cautious, but not enough to be truly afraid. To adaptability, Dutch said after the waiter retreated, raising his glass in a toast. The only trait that truly matters in our line of work. The others lifted their glasses, the crystal catching the light in momentary brilliance before the ritual was completed. These small ceremonies of camaraderie were important, reminders that they were bound together not just by business, but by a shared understanding of the world's true workings. Speaking of adaptation, Otto said, pushing his plate aside to make room for his ever-present notebook, we need to discuss our banking situation. The new federal regulations are making it harder to move large sums without scrutiny. Dutch leaned forward, his interest piqued. Financial matters always commanded his full attention. Money was not merely the reward for their activities, but the very measure of success in a world where conventional achievements were closed to men like them. What are you proposing? He asked, studying Otto's weathered face. We established legitimate fronts, more of them, spread across different sectors. Restaurants, laundries, taxi companies. We filter smaller amounts through each, keeping the individual transactions below the threshold for reporting. Otto's fingers traced invisible calculations on the tablecloth. It takes longer, but it's safer in this climate. Dutch considered this, his mind calculating not just the financial implications, but the personnel requirements, the potential weak points, the increased complexity. How many fronts are we talking about? 15 minimum, preferably 20. Otto adjusted his glasses, a nervous habit when proposing ideas he knew might face resistance, each requiring trusted management. A flash of irritation crossed Dutch's face. Finding 15 people we can trust with our money is a tall order, Otto. Not with direct access to everything, the accountant clarified quickly. Each manager sees only their piece. The complete picture exists only in my ledgers. The conversation was interrupted by a commotion at the restaurant entrance. A group of businessmen arriving, laughing too loudly, flush with the false confidence of early intoxication. Dutch watched them with mild contempt. The newly legitimate alcohol business had changed the character of public drinking, bringing out a class of consumer who would never have ventured into a speakeasy. The world's changing too fast, Rosencrantz observed, following Dutch's gaze. The world always changes, Dutch replied, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. The trick is seeing the change before others do. He thought again of Dewey and his crusade against racketeering. The prosecutor represented a new kind of threat, one that couldn't be bribed, threatened, or reasoned with. Dewey wanted headlines, wanted to build a reputation on the backs of men like Dutch. It was personal in its own way, just not the kind of personal that Dutch was accustomed to dealing with. I've been thinking about our legal situation, Dutch said carefully. We might need to consider a more permanent solution to our problems in New York. The table fell silent. They all understood what he was suggesting. Taking action against a prosecutor wasn't like eliminating a rival gangster or a wayward employee. It crossed a line that even the most hardened criminals hesitated to transgress. That's a dangerous road, Landau said finally, his voice lower than usual. The heat would be unprecedented. More dangerous than letting him build cases against us, Dutch challenged. More dangerous than waiting for him to come after us one by one. Otto removed his glasses, polishing them methodically with his handkerchief, a gesture the Dutch recognized as a sign of deep concern. The syndicate won't approve, Dutch. They'd made their position clear on provocative actions. The syndicate, the loose coalition of criminal organizations that had begun coordinating their activities to minimize conflict and heat from law enforcement. Dutch had a complicated relationship with this new order. He understood its purpose but chafed at its constraints. He had built his empire through bold action, not committee decisions. Sometimes survival requires risk, Dutch insisted, the edge in his voice betraying his frustration. We wait for permission, we might as well turn ourselves in now. A heavy silence descended on the table. The restaurant around them continued its evening rhythm, the clink of cutlery against plates, the murmur of conversation, the occasional burst of laughter, but their private bubble had turned cold with the weight of unresolved tension. Finally, Otto spoke, his voice carrying the gravitas of his years. Let me reach out to some contacts first. Feel the terrain before we commit to anything irreversible. We need to be smart about this, Dutch. Smarter than we've ever been. Dutch held the older man's gaze for a long moment before giving a curt nod. Otto had earned the right to counsel caution, even if caution wasn't Dutch's natural inclination. 1 week, he conceded. Then we revisit the discussion with whatever information you've gathered. The atmosphere relaxed slightly, the immediate crisis averted. Their meals continued, the conversation shifting to more routine matters. Collections, territory disputes, employee management. The business of crime was, in many ways, not so different from legitimate enterprise. Problems of logistics, personnel, and market share dominated their daily concerns. As the evening progressed, Dutch found himself increasingly preoccupied with thoughts of his own legacy. The repeal of Prohibition had marked the end of an era, and with it, perhaps the beginning of the end for men like him. The public's appetite for bootleg liquor had created unprecedented opportunities for those willing to operate outside the law. But what would the next chapter bring? Would there always be a place for the Dutch Schultzes of the world, or were they becoming relics, dinosaurs unaware of the approaching asteroid? He glanced around the table at his inner circle, Landau's watchful vigilance, Rosenkrantz's bulldog loyalty, Otto's analytical brilliance. They had survived Prohibition, gang wars, internal betrayals, and law enforcement pressure. They had adapted and evolved. Perhaps they would weather this storm as well. Outside, the rain had finally stopped, leaving behind a glistening Newark night. The streets reflected the neon signs and street lamps, like a watercolor painting slightly smudged. A police siren wailed in the distance, a familiar urban lullaby that neither alarmed nor concerned the men finishing their meal at the Palace Chop House. "It's getting late," Dutch announced, checking his pocket watch. "Let's call it a night. Otto, I want those projections for Newark on my desk tomorrow." They settled the bill, generously over-tipping as always, ensuring the staff's continued discretion and appreciation, and prepared to depart. Dutch shrugged into his overcoat, the weight of it comforting in the autumn chill. As they stepped outside, the cool night air carried the scent of wet asphalt and distant factories. Dutch paused to light a cigarette, the flame briefly illuminating his features in the darkness. For a moment he looked almost ordinary, just another businessman concluding an evening meeting, heading home to a comfortable bed. But as his car pulled up to the curb, a gleaming black Cadillac, Rosenkrantz already moving to open the door, the illusion dissolved. Dutch Schultz might adapt to changing times, might diversify his operations beyond bootlegging into the numbers, racket, and union control, but he would always be what he had made himself, a man apart from society's rules, a shadow player in a game with stakes higher than most could comprehend. "Same time tomorrow, gentlemen," he said, nodding to his associates. "The world keeps turning, and so do we." As the Cadillac pulled away from the curb, Dutch leaned back against the leather seat, allowing himself a rare moment of reflection. The year 1933 had brought unprecedented change. The end of Prohibition, Roosevelt's ambitious New Deal programs, the continuing struggle of the Depression. But through it all, Dutch had maintained his position, adapted his operations, survived when others faltered. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new threats, new opportunities. Dewey would continue his crusade. The syndicate would push for restraint. Rivals would probe for weakness. The dance would continue as it always had, with different partners but the same deadly rhythm. And Dutch Schultz, born Arthur Fleckenheimer in the Bronx tenements, would continue to dance, because for men like him, to stop was to fall, and to fall was to die. In the shadowy world he inhabited, momentum wasn't just an advantage, it was survival itself. The Cadillac disappeared into the Newark night, carrying its passenger toward whatever fate awaited, a fate that, like the man himself, refused to follow anyone else's rules. Thanks for listening to the story. Here are some information who love to hear details. Credible theories and unresolved mysteries. Schultz's buried treasure. The most enduring mystery is whether Dutch Schultz really hid a hoard of cash, jewels and bonds in the Catskill Mountains before his death, and if so, where? On his deathbed, Schultz raved about a treasure hidden in the woods, gilt-edged stuff in upstate New York. Gangland law says he buried $5 to $7 million in a steel box somewhere near Phoenicia, NY. Treasure hunters have scoured the area for decades, finding empty holes and tantalizing hints, but no definitive loot. Some historians think the treasure tale is plausible. Schultz certainly had large sums unaccounted for and expressed fear of leaving jail broke. Others suspect it's a red herring, perhaps his real treasure was offshore bank accounts, or that Luciano's men secretly retrieved the stash in 1935. To date, no credible evidence of a buried safe has surfaced. The FBI even did limited digs in the late 1940s, but came up empty. The treasure remains speculative, a mix of fact. Schultz did speak of treasure and legend, colorful details like maps and codes. Unless someone unearths a box of rotted currency in the Catskills, this mystery stays alive. Modern explorers often cite new clues, a tree carving or a rumored confession from a 1970s mobster, but the consensus is unproved. One well-supported sub-theory: if anyone retrieved it, it may have been gangsters, Gura Shapiro and Mendy Weiss, who were implicated in tidying up Schultz's affairs after his death. The allure of Schultz's gold keeps this mystery in the public imagination. The fate of Bo Weinberg, Schultz's top lieutenant, A.B. Bo Weinberg, vanished in late 1935, shortly before Schultz's own death. Underworld lore and the novel-to-film Billy Bathgate claim Schultz personally murdered Bo Weinberg by encasing his feet in cement and dumping him in the East River when Bo appeared to be negotiating with Luciano. No body was ever found. However, multiple sources support that Weinberg was indeed killed by Schultz. Schultz's lawyer Dixie Davis recounted that Weinberg had tried to haul in on Schultz's territory, and Schultz had no qualms about eliminating Bo, doing the job himself, according to some. After Schultz's death, Weinberg's brother testified he'd been searching for Bo to no avail. The well-supported theory is that in early October 1935, Schultz, suspecting betrayal, shot Weinberg, perhaps at the Harmony Hotel meeting or soon after, and disposed of him gangland style. Police believed Weinberg was dead. One informant even led them on a futile search for his cemented corpse. While the cement shoes detail might be embellished, the core theory that Schultz murdered Bo is widely accepted by historians, rated well supported by witness accounts like Davis's. The unresolved part is the where. Weinberg's remains have never been recovered, keeping a small aura of mystery. Secret second family. After Schultz's death, investigators found letters and photographs among his Newark hotel effects, suggesting he may have had another woman, besides Frances, and even children. Frances Fran Flegenheimer, his common-law wife, refused to comment on these revelations, and the mystery woman never came forward. This led to speculation that Schultz had maintained the secret family, possibly outside New York. Some whisper it was in New Jersey or Philadelphia. Given Schultz's penchant for compartmentalizing his life, he kept Frances largely out of the public eye too. It's plausible he had an earlier marriage or liaison with offspring that he kept hidden to avoid a weakness or a target for rivals. Letters found reportedly referred to the children and had a woman's name that wasn't Frances. The police tried briefly to trace it, but once Schultz was gone, the matter faded. 2 unidentified women even appeared at the morgue, claiming to have rights to Schultz's property, then disappeared. It's possible these were the other wife or her proxies. Without DNA or further documentation, it remains unresolved. Modern researchers have tried to track genealogy records to see if Arthur Flegenheimer quietly married. One 1929 New Jersey marriage certificate exists for an Arthur Flegen, but it's inconclusive. This theory is rated plausible because there is concrete evidence, letters, photos, something was there, but lacking enough detail to confirm. It remains an intriguing footnote. Perhaps somewhere out there descendants of Dutch Schultz might exist under another name, unaware of their link to the infamous Gangster. Who ordered the hit? Initially, 1935 newspapers speculated that Schultz was killed in a turf war with rival New York mobs. It took decades for historians to piece together that the hit was sanctioned by the Mafia Commission, which was itself secret at the time. Now, thanks to later informant testimony and writers like Burton Turkus, prosecutor of Murder Inc. we know, Charlie Lucky Luciano Majalansky, made the collective decision to eliminate Schultz. Luciano in his memoir hinted at it, and hitman Charles Workman, after his 1941 conviction, privately confirmed he was dispatched on Buchalter's orders. Thus it's essentially confirmed that the mob killed Schultz to stop him from killing Dewey. This is a well-supported historical fact, no longer a mere theory. The only unresolved nuance was who exactly gave the green light. Evidence suggests it was a unanimous commission vote, with perhaps Luciano and Lansky the most vocal. Some minor conflicting accounts claim that Albert Anastasia, Murder Inc. boss, independently decided to inform Luciano of Schultz's intentions to earn favor, thereby precipitating the hit. But this doesn't contradict the main point. So while early accounts left Schultz's murder unsolved, modern consensus, and even the FBI's files, now concur on the Commission's role. This is not unresolved. It's one of the more clear-cut cases of mob self-policing, rated well supported by historical evidence. Schultz's last words, code or nonsense. The bizarre stream of consciousness spoken by Schultz as he died has sparked endless interpretation. Was he uttering random imaginations of a feverish mind, or were some phrases coded clues perhaps to his treasure? For example, Schultz said, "Don't let Satan draw you too fast." Some have speculated Satan referred to Devil's Tombstone, a local landmark near Phoenicia, implying treasure is near Devil's Tombstone. He also mentioned French-Canadian bean soup, which treasure hunters have tried to link to a password or a location a stretch likely. Police stenographer John Long recorded every word, and at the time police concluded it was incoherent babble. However, years later, mob turncoat Joe Valachi claimed that Schultz, in his delirium, was actually reciting passages from the Old Testament and nursery rhymes, essentially nonsense, not clues. Modern cryptographers have attempted to find acrostics or maps in the words, and turned up nothing concrete. The theory that his last words hide a message, like a treasure map or the identity of his killer, remains purely speculative. Most scholars lean toward the view that the rants were products of a hallucinating brain shutting down. Medical experts note peritonitis can cause delirium. Thus, while intriguing, the notion of a secret code in the ramblings, rated speculative, is in the realm of gangster folklore rather than evidence-based theory. Nonetheless, it continues to inspire creative interpretations, exemplified by Burroughs' literary treatment which assumed there was deeper meaning, albeit artistic. Practically speaking, law enforcement found no actionable info in the last words. Second gunman at the chop house, plausible. The officially accepted hit team on Schultz consisted of Charles Workman and Mendy Weiss. Workman was caught in 1941, and Weiss was executed in 1944 for other murders. A lingering minor mystery, some accounts suggest a third man may have been present, or that Weiss left early, leaving Workman to finish the job alone. Workman reportedly complained that his accomplice fled, forcing him to hunt Schultz down in the bathroom solo. There's also an old rumor that notorious hitman Bugsy Siegel drove the getaway car, unproven and probably false. Siegel was on the West Coast by then. NYPD files mention only 2 gunmen seen. The possibility of a mob mole inside Schultz's crew tipping off the assassins has also been floated. Some suspect his bodyguard Lulu Rosenkrantz might have been secretly compromised, since he was recently disgruntled over pay cuts. However, given Lulu died defending Schultz, that seems unlikely. As for Marty Crompier's simultaneous shooting in Manhattan the same night, some wonder if it was coordinated by the Commission to wipe out all Schultz's key men. Crompier survived, though. That coordination is highly plausible, essentially part of the plan to decapitate Schultz's organization. The only slightly unresolved detail is identity of every individual involved in the hit. Workman and Weiss are confirmed, but any lookout or driver remains unknown. Overall, the mystery around the hit logistics is minor and mostly of interest to mob aficionados. Plausibly, more than 2 people were involved, as is common, but the principal shooters are known. In sum, Dutch Schultz's story, even decades later, leaves some tantalizing loose ends, particularly about hidden wealth and personal secrets. While many of these theories remain unproven or speculative, they are part of the rich lore that continues to surround the Dutchman's name, ensuring historians and treasure hunters alike keep digging, sometimes literally for answers. Fact. Check flags. Birth year discrepancy, 1901 versus 1902. Some sources list Schultz's birth as August 6, 1902, but most authoritative records, including his gravestone and baptismal certificate, list 1901. The 1901 date is better attested. The old Newark biography and FBI file used 1901. The confusion likely arose from Schultz himself, occasionally knocking a year off his age to appear younger. We adopt 1901, given the weight of evidence. Flag History.com erroneously used 1902, but that seems to be a minor error echoed by some secondary listings. The consensus among historians is 1901. Nickname origin. Self-adopted versus given. FBI records state Schultz was nicknamed Dutch by old associates after a fearsome gangster of that name, whereas some popular accounts and Schultz's own propaganda claimed he simply took it from the Schultz trucking company he worked for, which is correct. It may be a bit of both. The FBI got its info from interviews, possibly from detectives who heard street lore. Schultz trucking was real. He did work there briefly, post-prison, and started using Schultz to avoid the stigma on Flegenheimer, which likely led to Dutch Schultz, since Dutch was common slang for Germans. But contemporaries recalled a gangster named Dutch Schultz active in the 1910s, so Arthur's adoption of it may have been half homage, half convenience. We mention both versions, noting it's contested. Given conflicting sources, we flagged it but leaned on FBI's explanation as it appears in a vetted official history. Joey Noe's death 1928 to 1930. Some timelines place Joey Noe's fatal shooting in 1930, but primary sources including NY Times obit show it was late October 1928, with Noe dying of complications on November 25, 1928. The confusion arises because Schultz didn't fully take over Bronx operations until 1930, so some narratives fold Noe's demise into the early 30s storyline. We clarified Noe was shot in 1928 by Legs Diamond's order. This is well documented in period newspapers. We cite the Legends of America summary confirming October 1928. Stephanie St. Clair's fate in the war, a conflicting point in sources. Some say St. Clair handed her business to Bumpy Johnson in a truce implying she stayed active. Others claim she was arrested and that effectively ended her fight, which is accurate. Both happened. St. Clair was indeed jailed briefly in 1933 on policy charges, but after release she did align with Johnson and Luciano. The Wikipedia entry says the war ended with St. Clair's arrest and imprisonment, but Johnson's bio clarifies he brokered a deal post. We navigated this by stating St. Clair's arrest helped end her direct leadership, and Johnson struck a deal after Schultz's death. The nuance St. Clair survived and lived until 1969, but post-1935 she was effectively out of the numbers game, leaving Johnson as the point man. We noted both aspects to reconcile the different emphases. Last words, transcript. Variations. Different sources print Schultz's delirious words with slight differences. Some include French-Canadian bean soup, others omit it. Punctuation and line breaks vary. These are minor transcription variances from the same raw notes. We use the Newark Ledger version as baseline and Times excerpt. The gist is consistent, so it doesn't affect factual accuracy of events, but we ensure not to misquote any particularly famous line. Commission meeting attendees. Most sources agree. Lucky Luciano, Meyer Lansky, Lepka Buchalter, Jake Shapiro, Frank Costello were present and voted against Schultz. A couple of older narratives omit Lansky or include Albert Anastasia as present. Based on recent scholarship, such as Raab, Five Families, Lansky was indeed influential in that decision, and Anastasia was informed, but not on the commission. He headed Murder Inc. and got the assignment via Buchalter. We portray it accordingly, and flag that accounts differ only slightly on who physically sat in that meeting room. Considering Luciano himself confirmed the gist in his later years, we treat it as settled that the commission as a whole authorized the hit. Minor discrepancies in exact attendees don't change the outcome, but we mention the key players for accuracy. These flags highlight areas where careful source reconciliation was needed. We aim to use the most reliable data, gravestone for birth, contemporary news for dates, and note the discrepancies so the reader is aware of them and why we chose one version over another. Each instance we've leaned on primary documentation or scholarly consensus to resolve the conflict in favor of factual accuracy. Thanks for listening the story. Do not forget to subscribe, like the video, and share it with your circle. Let us know where you are from, what time it is now, and your thoughts on Dutch Schultz in the comments.